sessions or having an LPSC. So kudos to all of you Venusians out there that are really, giving us exponential numbers of Venus talks. So it's really very exciting. Okay, this talk is a little long, so I'm going to skip some things and I'll come back to them later. But Veritas is a very succinct payload. We have just 2 instruments and a gravity science investigation, but all of these make multiple types of measurements. So with the VISAR instrument, we have a global digital elevation model at 250-meter posting, 6-meter vertical resolution, global SAR at 30 meters, and targeted imaging at 15 meters for about 25% of the planet. We'll make the first interferometric deformation maps on another planet. For the VEM instrument, it has 6 surface bands, very high SNR. It'll be much higher SNR than other observations of the surface. It has 8 atmospheric and calibration bands. So one of the big questions with that instrument is, of course, are the tessera felsic? Are they an indication of past water where basalt has melted in the presence of water? Are they distinct from the basaltic plains? For gravity science, with the 90% of the planet will have 106-kilometer resolution, some places much better. And the moment of inertia factor and the Love numbers will be measured very precisely, including with radar tie points. And that'll give us the ability to get core size to about plus or minus 20 kilometers. We're hoping to actually make a global map at 120-kilometer resolution, 10-meter vertical accuracy. We're pretty certain that we can do this, so I'm putting it up here. And, I know there's a lot of probably Martians out there. So, this kind of gives you a sense of some of the analogs for the data that's been acquired for Mars. Some of our data sets are better resolution. Certainly the imaging is not better resolution. But, for Mars, it took a number of missions to build up this kind of data set. And we'll be able to really, get these foundational data sets with Veritas. Okay, so when are we launching? That's the big question, right? When we proposed and were selected in 21, we proposed to launch in 26. And of course, budget woes have pushed us out. We're really advocating to launch in 31. 32 is not as desirable for a number of different reasons. And so we're just awaiting NASA budget to come together and see when we can actually get off the ground. But it's kind of a nominal timeline. All right, so we have a number of science goals and objectives focused on rocky planet evolution, on activity in the surface, and past and present water. We want to be able to determine the global rock type with the VEM instrument, terrains, and look for a record of prior geologic regimes. Has the volcanism been steady or catastrophic? What about subduction? Is it happening today? Can it give us clues as to how plate tectonics may have started on the Earth? And what about the interior, the viscosity, the core state size and state? We have a lot of different ways to look for activity that I'll go over. And, as I said, the felsic tessera, these huge plateau areas, are likely an indication of past water if they are in fact felsic. And we're also looking for water coming out of volcanoes from deep in the interior today. I don't have time to give you information about all of these different questions, but I'll pick out just a couple to sort of highlight. I'll talk a little bit about the how would we find evidence of past regimes and what are we doing for active processes. So this shows you an image from a Soviet-era lander. A number of sites had the chemical composition measured and indicated basalt. But the question is, what about these tessera features? They are highly deformed. There's indication from the Virtus data that they may be felsic in nature, but only one of them was covered by Virtus. And this is for comparison, same scale, but radar versus a visual image of a old deformed granitic terrain. Just because they look alike doesn't mean they're the same, but we're going to be addressing this question. And we'll do that using the VEM spectra. This is from Berlin's Planetary Spectroscopy Lab, where we've taken a number of spectra at Venus conditions. And the tiny little bars at the bottom of the basalt area, that's the error bars. And that's really a function, dominant function of the precision of the topography. So because we have very precise topography data, we can get those small error bars and distinguish between the basalt and the granite. This gives you kind of an indication of how much better the topography is going to be. We have Magellan resolution for Hawaii and Veritas on the right. And, I think that it's really critical to get this high resolution topography for a planet where we can only acquire radar data. Adjacent flows are not necessarily going to be visible in the radar data. There's no erosion that changes the roughness over time. So, being able to see things in topography is going to be, really, really transformative. The gravity data is also going to be much better. It's two-way Ka band coherent up and down. And, everywhere it'll be much better than Magellan versus Veritas. As I said, some will be, sub 100 kilometers in resolution. Later on, I'll talk about some of the great things we're anticipating with this data. This gives an example of how we can look for past geologic regimes. And this is GRAIL data that has been reduced in resolution to Veritas and Magellan. You can see that with Veritas resolution, we can pick out these, the dashed lines there are rifts that we're seeing in the GRAIL data in the subsurface. So, we may be able to see tectonic structures that are buried with the gravity data. And, probably most of you don't really remember before there was MOLA data, but we really had no clue what was going on in the Northern Hemisphere before MOLA. People thought it was, a very young surface on Mars, but in fact, it's, covered with impact basins. So, and so the Veritas topography will actually be a little bit better than MOLA. So I fully expect we'll get, just crazy new insights. And of course, resurfacing on Venus, has it been steady? Has it been catastrophic? What we want to do is understand what is the dark material that covers the floor of 80% of impact craters. It could be aeolian material, it could be volcanism. So we'll be looking to understand what's in the inside of these craters, as well as what's on the outside of the craters. This shows topographic profiles using LOLA data for the moon. And on one side, this impact is flooded and not on the other side. You can't really tell in the image data, but when you look at the topography, you can see on the one side that the impact ejecta is much shallower and levels off. So it's clearly been flooded on one side. So this is kind of work we're going to do to understand the interaction between the craters and the volcanism and or aeolian processes. Okay, so I've zoomed ahead. And I want to tell you, give you a little advertisement for the many other Veritas presentations that will be held at the meeting. We had a field campaign in Iceland in 2023 in conjunction with the DLR FSAR planes. We acquired X and S data, S-band data for some, geologic, some volcanic units that are unvegetated in Iceland. So it's a great field location. We had the Vemulator there to acquire spectra, and we were on the ground taking permittivity data as well as very fine scale surface roughness with LiDAR and with drone data. So we have those field measurements acquired more or less simultaneously with the FSAR data. So there's a number of talks discussing that. There's posters tonight, talk about the Vemulator tomorrow. And then there are overview talks about the overall campaign and the permittivity results on Friday. And then, I mentioned some of the things that people are anticipating with the gravity data. Poster tonight giving an overview of the data set that we're expecting. Some talks tomorrow. The first is about the density that we expect to be able to derive for the tessera plateaus as a way to kind of validate the composition. Next one is about the potential for using gravity and topography data to assess activity at Corona, and then more about the interior structure. How can we get this, very precise core size and the interior viscosity? And then there's a couple of posters tonight about the spectroscopy lab as well as the VEM instrument. And finally, I'm happy to say we have 5 undergraduate interns who have been working with different people on the project and through the SOAR program. So they're all here and presenting their research over last summer. There's a little SOAR logo on their posters. So please go, introduce yourselves and say hi. They've all done some great work. So we're excited to have them here. Okay, done.
Awesome. Thank you, Sue. Perfectly on time. Okay. Our next speaker is Noam Eisenberg, who will be giving us a talk related to 3 flybys of Venus and Parker Solar Probe data.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. There we are. Okay. Yeah, I'm here to talk about some of the most recent data obtained for the surface and atmosphere of Venus by this little known spacecraft called Parker Solar Probe. Happens to be flying around the sun, studying the sun. I don't know what all that's about. But in order to enable the ability to touch the sun like Parker is doing, it had to fly by Venus 7 times to alter its orbit to get lower and lower and lower and touch the sun. The 7th and last of the Venus flybys took place on November 6th of 2024, just before the closest ever flyby to the sun, passed by the sun. And each time Parker passed by Venus, it conducted science. 4 of the flybys were on over the day side, 3 were over the night side. And while the spacecraft passed over the night side, it was able to turn some of its, it used its instruments during each flyby, but in order to, when it was flying over the night side, it was able to turn its cameras, the Whisper cameras, and I have the expansion of the acronym in a moment because I can't remember it off the top of my head, but is it possible to run that animation, or can I do it? I can click it. Oh, so there. So this is a model of a planning model of what the 7th flyby looked like. It was flying over the Beta Atla-Themis region, which is different than flybys 3 and 4, which flew over Abda. And the 2 frames here are the Whisper outer camera and Whisper inner camera. They have overlapping broadband visible wavelengths, but band passes, which I'll show you in a moment. But what you saw was the predict flyby over Magellan topography. But what we have here is the actual flyby itself from the 2 cameras, a subset of that flyby. And I'll thank you for coming to my talk. But well, I'll show you, we'll go into more detail about this. What we're seeing is we're not just passing over the nighttime clouds of Venus. What we're seeing is we're looking through those clouds to the surface of Venus through an atmospheric window, which really hadn't been explored. It had been theorized, but not really explored until Parker flew by Venus for the first time on the night side in 2020. So what we're looking at on the top here is the Whisper bandpass, which is, and again, visible to near IR. And we're also looking at the known, or the more commonly understood, opacity windows that have allowed spacecraft to look through the sulfuric acid clouds to the surface, seeing the surface emissions from the hot planet over the night side, 1 micron, 1.1 micron. These are the common band passes that that instruments like BEM and such are going to be using. But the Whisper band pass is clearly not in those nice, comfortable bands, but it is in the tail end of some of these opacity bands that are in the just very, very near infrared, that there is still sensitivity in the Whisper imager. The Whisper imagers are designed to look at solar dust and solar wind, so they're pretty sensitive. And when we, and also, I'll also note for additional information is that these lines, the oxygen green line, this is an atmospheric emission line in the Venus atmosphere, and the oxygen red line are also well within these band passes. So not only are we getting some signal from the surface potentially through the atmosphere, but we're also potentially seeing oxygen glow. And of course, there are more oxygen emission lines as well. These are just 2 of the most prominent. So the Whisper images can in fact sense. Are we going to go forward? I have just lost the ability to go forward. There we go. They can sense the surface emission from the planet. So here we have the expected radiance from the surface, and here are the band passes, and this is kind of the expected reception from the 2 cameras the light coming off the surface. The relative effect of the air glow is probably stronger in Whisper Eye because it's got more sensitivity in general. And we can see that in some of the Whisper Eye images. They're a little harder to deconvolve. It's a little harder to see the surface through, so they require some more processing. So, where are we going? There we go. So this is just, again, sort of a view of the flyby somewhat quickly. One thing that you'll know, this is looking at Whisper O in particular, where you'll see as things change as we fly by, we actually had 3 different exposure times as we were zooming by the surface. And when we are trying to deconvolve that, not only we have to deal with surface emission, potentially some clouds, we also have to deal with smear across the surface from our velocity. The closest approach of Parker to Venus during this flyby was around 300 something kilometers. So super close and therefore super fast. And you'll also see in the corners, we have some instrument artifacts. These are all things we're still actively dealing with because we've just managed in the last week to get our level 2 process images where we can start doing the more quantitative data to do these analyses. This is a slower version of the flyby. And you'll note that, there's all this modeling that you see there's a combination here of cloud features and surface features. And we'll go into the next stuff and show some of that. But what I want to show quickly here is this view and this view over here. This is how we're reprojecting the Venus data right now. We're using the APL small body mapping tool. Even though Venus is not a small body, the tool has some really great ways to reproject and review data from planetary missions. And this sort of shows some of the work we're doing right now to sort of place the images. This bright streak is actually atmosphere that's still placed on top of the surface. So we have some adjustments to make as we realign and are able to now look hopefully down at the surface. And you can see how our square image gets distorted because we're looking at this viewing angle. But I'm going to step through a couple, a little sightseeing tour now of the flyby, and a couple things of note, right? What we're seeing here is on the Magellan topography here. So we have, low features are in the cool colors, high features in the red colors. And kind of the opposite is true for geologic features showing through in Whisper, because most of the emissivity signal from the surface comes from temperature. So something is lower, it's warmer, it sends more, it gets more signal to the camera. And so, for example, Madaraka Corona is this little blue smudge here. It's a lighter smudge over there. Nangbian Chasma, Varmans, there's some lows and highs, some darker areas, some brighter areas next to some darker areas here. Navka Planitia, this low down here, is also here. And we're convinced about that. We are working on remapping everything so that we can place everything correctly. But as we go sort of from step to step, we can see the features track. I didn't know I had to press this hard. Is this going to work? There we go. So there's the next step, and you can see the corona is progressing. Next step, and we can see things moving across, and essentially, so Navka Planitia, which is pretty uniformly low, also has a bunch of different lava flows on it. And some of the modeling we see may well also be related to some of that. And of course, I would step back to show you something else about that, some potential atmospheric features, because some of this modeling that we see does not necessarily coordinate with topographic variation. And some of that variation is probably due to different cloud thicknesses. In addition, one thing to note is that the horizon, if we were dealing with simple surface emissivity, the horizon would be darkening towards the limb. It brightens towards the limb, and that's because of the oxygen air glow. I don't have much time left, so I'm going to step through a few more things. We have more features coming on that we can see, that we can align. These are the things that we're going to get quantitative about over the next little while. As in the late parts of this flyby, we have more tests that are coming into view. We have the Venera 13 landing site coming into view. And we also have features that we have to also deal with. For example, possible cloud features. This does not coincide with any surface elevation. It's a horizontal streak across the data. So that's almost certainly some kind of cloud feature, which is similar to some of the things we've seen with the Akatsuki and other places. Other things that we're tracking, cloud motions, things that we have to deconvolve. And we're taking the data from flyby 7, flyby 4, and flyby 3 from both cameras, and we're working on integrating all of that to see the full picture of the surface of Venus from Parker Solar Probe, and projects that we have to remove the model and remove the thermal and atmospheric features and get at these residuals, which was where we have potential interesting things to say about composition and or surface features. So thank you very much.
Alrighty, our next speaker is Richard Ernst, and he will be updating us on activities of the International Venus Research Consortium.
Good, thank you all. It's great to have this opportunity to share with you about the work of our International Venus Research Group. I want to acknowledge this group has been founded and led by myself and Hafida El-Bilali. We're both at Carleton University and Jim Head of Brown University. And just a moment, Hafida, could you just identify yourself for everybody? Just stand up, because she's been a key partner in expanding the group, Hafida. And maybe even at the, and even at the end, maybe if she can come up on stage and she can answer some of the questions as well. So we've been so excited to have the opportunity to have a group of students that we've been training in planetary mapping, specifically on Venus. And the idea is that we're looking forward, particularly to all the exciting Venus missions. And we want to make sure that we've got a group of people who are trained in the current available data, who are available to then step in to the new extraordinary data that we'll be getting from the new missions, and be able to have a basis for interpreting the new data. Also, this gives us an opportunity to answer all sorts of questions about Venus with the current data. We're doing detailed geological mapping, building on the previous more reconnaissance mapping, 1 to 10 million scale, for instance, of Ivanov and Head, and also the quadrangle mapping at 1 to 5 million. Our mapping is typically about 1 to 500,000, so about 10 times more precise, doing detailed geological mapping and developing geological histories for areas. Here's our group. We've got about 40 students we've been training from 4 or 5 different countries and a number of different universities. And we've been doing this since about 2021. And in that time to present, we've had about 79 LPSC abstracts, mostly posters, and we've had a number of publications now that have been in various things, Icarus and Planetary and Space Science, also recently in Journal of Volcanology and Geothermal Research, and then also some Nature Family ones. And so it's really neat to watch these students developing initial mapping of the area and then proceeding to the step of producing publications, LPSC abstracts, then publications, and we have another 20 or so publications in progress right now. 5 soon will be submitted. So it's kind of a neat process, and we're thrilled with all the students from all the different countries who've been participating with us. There's our logo. This is the distribution of areas on Venus from the different groups where we're doing detailed geological mapping. You see it's quite an extensive aerial coverage. It also is very extensive coverage of different kinds of units. So here we've been looking mainly at, here's the kind of things we've been looking at, Graben systems. And one of our things, based on our experience of terrestrial systems, is we think many of these Graben, because on Venus, absence of erosion means that the surface expression of dolerite dikes can be as Grabens. And so we've been spending a lot of effort looking at Graben systems on Venus and assessing which ones could potentially be underlain by dike swarms, looking at both radiating and circumferential and linear dike swarms from that process, rift faults, lava flows, small shield volcanoes, and then also looking at the broader context of regios, mons, flucti, corona, anemone, patera, planitia, et cetera, chasmata, canali, tesseras, and then splotches from impact. So we've been doing a lot of kind of coverage, and also just from the aspect of regios, a lot on Atlas Regio, two big papers coming out of that. Beta Regio just got published, and so on. And so we're trying to catch an understanding of the broader context of the regios, which are thought to be kind of plume related in general. We've also been taking, detailed geological mapping of lava flows, which is a complicated process. And we look forward to the new missions where, it's going to be much easier to map things in detail. So we've got on these diagrams here, each of these names here represents an LPSC public abstract. And then the ones in yellow are current abstracts, and then also where there's been a publication. Okay, and so some of the things that we've been looking at are, surprisingly, in the absence of erosion, we can still see collapse features on Venus, which we infer to be related to collapse above a magma reservoir. And in some cases, like we can see on the right here, you have a collapse feature here, and it's leading to an over 1,000-kilometer long lava flow. So it's an opportunity to compare the volume of magma or the areal extent, inferred volume of flows, for instance, coming from a single reservoir. And here are some other examples of features in the Loshen region that we think are collapses above magma reservoirs, sill-like reservoirs here, for instance, and feeding channelized flows. Let's see, how do we go back here? Okay, it's just one more thing about this. So in terms of, this is an extensive lava flow sequence here, and this represents some 53 lava flow units mapped into grouped into 11 flow packages, and then developed into 6 stages of volcanic activity. We've done a similar thing with the publication of Thea Mons, which is part of Beta Regio, some 88 flow units, 19 flow groups, and 3 kind of stages of evolution there, grouped into 2 different magmatic centers with irradiating lava flows, radiating dike swarms, and radiating triple junction rift systems associated with each of these 2 centers of Thea Mons, about 200 kilometers apart. I forgot somehow to put in an image that was on Atlas Regio. We have 2 neat publications led by Fidel Bilali, where we were looking at the radiating dike swarm systems of Atlas Regio, the radiating swarms extending out for 4 different magmatic centers, the largest being from Azamans, going out radially for 1,200 kilometers, and then the dike swinging into a more common stress pattern. And the idea is that out to 1,200 kilometers, I wish I had the images here, and I really apologize for that, but out to 1,200 kilometers, the radial patterns are giving us the scale of the underlying mantle plume head, and then the swing in trend is giving us the indication of the external regional stress at the time. And one of the remarkable things is FIDA discovered this 3,700 kilometer long single inferred dolerite dike. So a single dike extending out radially for 1,200 kilometers, swinging 57 degrees and paralleling Parga Chasmata, indicating that Parga Chasmata rifting was in extensional mode at the same time as this dike of Azamans was being emplaced. So let's go. So I talked about this. Coronae. So we've mapped about 34 different coronae in detail with abstracts and some publications already. And one of the things that's really context for this is that from our terrestrial experience, we recognize beautiful radiating graben systems on Venus, probably to be related to underlying radial dike swarms, as we've talked about just a moment ago for Atlas Regio. We also recognize on Earth some circumferential dike swarms, circular dike swarms, up to 800 kilometers in radius. And on Venus, we think that this is an interpretation of some of the circumferential dike swarms we see on, or circumferential fracture systems on Venus we see associated with corona, that there are actually circumferential dike swarms. Here's an example here that shows from one of our students, Mohammed Ben Marzouk, and this was recently published in Icarus, and the idea, okay, time is short here. So this is just, I'll just emphasize here that this is showing the presence of a radiating swarm swinging into the stress influence of another magmatic center. And then here are 2 circumferential centers where the radiating swarm here is diverging around it. So it's a way of monitoring relative stress changes. And just to keep moving, here's a nice corona HANGO, which we doubled in size with its circumferential pattern, where we think that there's radiating swarms associated with domal uplift. And then as the plume head spreads, circumferential develop and develop beyond the annulus. So we have a radius or a diameter almost 2,000 kilometers, almost doubled in size by what we think is the inferred spread of the circumferential swarm. Well, I won't go into rift zones. We've done something with Canali. We're looking at a lot of tessera, including from Naima Hanur, who's doing a great detailed work as well, mapping in tessera. And in some cases, we're able to trace in Eve Corona, for instance, which is south of Alpha Regio, and is in the target of the Da Vinci mission. We are mapping graben systems that we think are dikes from the Eve Corona area into the tessera area, so that some of those fractures are probably dikes. So finally, just to indicate themes here, we're grouping magmatic features into and tectonic features into discrete events like on Earth. We're recognizing graben-fissure systems as in many cases the expression of underlying dike swarms. We're identifying the sources of flows. We're locating magma reservoirs and seeing how the volume of dikes or flows from those reservoirs can give us some insight into the plumbing system. And we're also thinking about the climatic aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. All right, our next speaker is Gerard Gallardo y Perez, who will be speaking about searching for Venus in Iceland.
Right. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Gerard Gallardo, I'm aerospace engineer, radar scientist, and a PhD student at Imperial College London. And today I'm here to talk about two things mainly. So I will show you a methodology on change detection between SAR images of Magellan and the future SAR images of VISER and VENSER radars. And I'll also show you some very preliminary analysis on our Iceland campaign that we did, the UKSA Iceland campaign we did last summer, and how those signatures link with SAR images of Iceland and how that helps this methodology. So, right. So this is the challenge. It's not an easy challenge, but it is very worth it because 45 years of temporal baseline between SAR images means potentially a lot of changes. And if we are able to detect and quantify all these changes, then we have a lot of information regarding surface processes, heat and mass transfer of the planet that we can fit into our models and get a lot of information there. But it's a big challenge because, of course, backscatter SAR images depend a lot on system design, and the system design and technology advances between these 45 years are enormous. So it is a challenge, but let's accept it. This is the plan. And it has many facets, but potentially usually define them in these three blocks. Today, I'm here mainly to talk about radiometry, so how backscatter is influenced by different surface properties and different system design changes. I would like to use this forum to talk about, I think, the most critical factor, which is to have a global DEM, at least with the resolution of Magellan. And this is important because it links both the radiometry and the geometry. We have Magellan Global Topographic Record, but it has a resolution 1 or 2 orders of magnitude less than the SAR, and it has some known errors. Some of them we've been working on recently. So to really update this topography is really important, and I think at this point, the Veritas mission is very important for that, to get a new global topographic data record with a resolution that we can be comparable to the SAR imagery. So the way I see it, the key thing is here. There are these changes in backscatter associated with system changes. If we are able to model them with a certain confidence statistically, then by the time the new images come in, we will be able to separate potential changes associated to geological processes on the surface from the system changes that come from there. And that is really the goal when it comes to radiometry. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these images. Magellan observation geometry was complicated, to say the least. That's typically a problem when it comes to consistency in backscatter, because backscatter depends on incidence angle, and of course, it varied across the planet, so it's difficult to make comparisons even between cycles of Magellan, etc. And this is typically a problem, but paradoxically, I think it is very good in order to help us with intermission SAR change detection. And the reason it is very good is that if you take a look at typical geological maps of different areas of Venus, you can see that they spread quite well across latitudes, which means that potentially many of these geological units have been imaged at different incidence angles. And I think that's an opportunity because it's difficult, even on Earth, to get scattering curves of all these units, to cover all the scattering processes between, let's say, 15 degrees to 50 degrees. So one methodology can do is to go across Magellan-SAR images and select certain points, co-register with your topography. It can be global topographic data record, it can be stereo, shape from shading if you like, and then compare that mean backscatter and plot it against the local incidence angle. Here are some examples also using geological masks. And basically, this allows us to get this full scattering curve of a certain terrain unit, okay? Of course, the problem is, what is the terrain unit? There are many ways to define that. You can do that visually, you can do that with morphological masks, you can do that with unsupervised radar segmentation. There are many ways to define what that is. But this, I believe, is quite unique to what we have on Venus, because on Earth observation, you don't have these changes on incidence angle with spaceborne missions. Plus, we have all these annoying things like vegetation, water, snow, humans, and Venus, supposedly we don't have that. So the scattering mechanism is potentially simplified in that sense. And that means an opportunity, I think. Of course, here are just some examples. You can notice variability of all these pictures with incidence angle, enormous variability. This is because, and this is something we can come up in the Q&A if you like, but there's a lot of work to do in just gathering a large amount of data and what is really significant in that data. There's a lot of filtering, and you got to be smart about what exactly you're mapping there, because there's millions of pixels, and what is really meaningful is to select which ones are helpful to derive this methodology. Okay, so here is the key aspects of how I would picture this. You can get this scattering curve from a terrain unit you define across Venus with Magellan data, and then one thing you could do is to select an Earth analog, potentially that you think it's likely to be similar. Of course, that's always an assumption when we work with planetary analogs. And then with radar systems that may mimic the new configurations of Veritas or Envision, you can image those targets with a wide array of incidence angles with these new wavelength and polarizations. And so sort of this creates an empirical model, which is giving you this transfer function between the two systems. Iceland, the FSAR data campaign that was mentioned before, it's very useful because it's been planned exactly to mimic Weiser and Venser, and hence it's potentially one of the best data sets we have. And it's also important to have some ground truth to that. And the ground truth is important for two things. One, to understand what we're looking at and if we believe from the geological context that it is similar to what we expect on Venus. But most importantly, we can use the surface characteristics that we can see on the ground to use some empirical models of backscatter and compare them with the radar imagery to understand what's actually going on, what's driving the scattering, what scale, what are the factors. And that's precisely what we went out to do on Iceland. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with these locations. We did several things on the ground. These are some of the survey locations that we saw. This is a 1D pin profilometer. This is very small, and this has some problems on its own, but it's also millimeter scale, which means that it gets us a very fine scale roughness, if you'd like. From here, we can get like very basic surface parameters like roughness, RMS height, or correlation length, creating the autocorrelation function. You can calculate RMS slope and other parameters of use. We did that with one dimension with the pin profilometer, but we also did that with drone photogrammetry. So we have surveys in 2 dimensions with digital surface models of 3 to 6 centimeters grid spacing. And we can get the same information from there, but in 2 dimensions. This is just some example of one of the field days that we had. You can see some of the ground points we took and some of the drone surveys of the same area. And here, and I think this is quite nice to see, this would be a Venser resolution cell, 30 meters for 30 meters. This is one backscatter estimate. Can you see the complexity inside this one resolution cell, all the roughness scales, all the textures? Which one is driving this backscatter? Which one is dominant? This is the kind of studies that we can do with the data we gathered. Here are just some examples of all the pin profilometers, the very small roughness scale. And if we put them together, we imaged lava flows, surveyed lava flows, but also like very, other kinds of terrains of volcanic origin. And you put them all together, you can compare it with very typical roughness criterions for at least for Venser and Weiser. And what you get spatially potentially makes more sense like this. What you get is a very complex picture. So there are surfaces that may appear rough to Venser, will appear specular to Weiser or vice versa. Roughness in X scale and Y scale don't always correlate. So there's a lot of effort to be put into this, a lot of modeling to do for different types of terrain. But if we manage to do that in parallel with radar data, then we will be able to really understand the scattering of lavas, I think, in a very more deep sense that we have currently. So we can do the same with drone photogrammetry. And here are just some examples. This is the same RMS height and correlation length, but in 2 dimensions. You can pick your direction of choice, or you can do an average. And one of the things we can see with that is this fractal nature of surface that we would expect, or multifractal, if you like, with the patch size of the drone data. This is some example with the lava flow in Askia. This is from FSAR data, doing an unsupervised segmentation. And you can see, again, creating these curves with incidence angle with sigma intensity. So how do you put it all together? We have ground data. We have drone data. They can be co-registered or separated. And we have the parameters of FSAR, or the equivalent to Venser and Weiser, linking together with models. You can generate some signatures with those models, and then you can compare them directly with the radar imagery. You can use the electric constants also from samples or from inverse modeling. And this will create this link that will tell you what's dominant in the backscatter. And then you can use the FSAR imagery with the Magellan imagery to create this link. And this link, I think it's worth it to try to simulate Venser imagery from Magellan. And then when we have Venser and Weiser imagery, we will be able to say, hopefully with a certain degree of confidence, oh, this is a real change in the surface. Oh, this is just an artifact due to system changes. Thank you very much.
Okay, we would like to thank all of the speakers, and we would also invite them back to the stage now for the Q&A. We will now have a 20-minute Q&A. If you're interested in asking a question, please line up behind the mic. Please make sure to announce your name and your affiliation. If you are joining us virtually, also make sure that you write your name and your affiliation. We have 20 minutes for questions. Are there any questions?
I will ask a question while everybody thinks about their questions and walks up to the microphone. How's that? Richard, my question is for you. You were showing maps of lava flows, and I'm very interested in how one maps lava flows on Venus and what those boundaries actually mean. Are you mapping a flow? Are you mapping a flow field? What are you mapping? Or what are you interpreting your mapping when you're drawing those boundaries for the lava flows in particular?
Oh, great question. Yeah, and that's so what we've done is we were looking for obviously radar brightness differences. So that was a first step. And so we were mapping boundaries of radar brightness differences. But then we were also then trying to look at the distribution, the pattern, the elongation of sets of these things, and then developing into flow groups. And so then there was the flow groups that we were using going forward as kind of the entities that then we would look as larger packages, larger sequences, and then once we've got, 11 sequences or, number of sequences, then we were looking across different sides of the volcano, for instance, and developing kind of stages of, in the case of Atiramon, 6 different sort of stages of activity. So that was kind of that process. And it was a real iterative process. I mean, it was going, 6 or 7 or 8 different times, looking at it again. We, as Hafida and I and other team members, looking with the students to try and say, okay, is this something that is consistent? We look at it again. If it continues to change, then okay, we're not there yet. And so it was a process like that was very iterative. until
Okay.
we were comfortable.
Thank you. And I'm going to identify myself after the fact. I'm Jenny Witten. Sorry for those of you online. I broke my own rule. Okay, let's start with those people in the room.
Hi, my name is Dan Lalich. I'm at Cornell University. I have a question about the last talk about the radar backscatter curves. So I know you talked about this already, but I'm going to give you the chance to expand on it a little bit. You talked about how the sort of backscatter behavior as it is related to the roughness depends a lot on this length scale, so the wavelength. You're talking about different wavelengths of radar, so it sounds like to cut to the chase, that building this transfer function between Magellan and Veritas sort of relies on your analog being a good analog for what you're looking at on Venus. So how can you be confident that you've chosen the right analog when you're doing this analysis?
I think this is, I guess, expandable to any kind of questions we do on Earth regarding finding analogs on Venus. The idea is to use all this geological knowledge we have on Venus, all these people that have been mapping it for years. And it's not only, you have radar data there, but you have all your interpretation and context, and you can build different units. If you put enough of people together that knows all this kind of context and geology to select places on Earth, that would be our best bets. I mean, that's why we went to Iceland to calibrate this. We are part of an initiative, for instance, called the Avengers Initiative, with a lot of people involved. With the sole mission is to put together all these experts in the field that try to locate the best locations on Earth to find analogs, because analogs are, not only for radar, but for all the instruments, for all kind of work that we want to do with the new missions. So that's the effort, but it's an assumption, as you say. It's built on that assumption. The more we are able to discretize and define units, the more data we have on that, the more we will be able to refine these models. So I would say Iceland is great, but we need to go more places. We need to, so it's,
Yeah, thanks. That's really cool stuff. And I'm going to track you down later to talk in more depth.
Thanks.
We have an online question for Sue. He asked two questions, so I'll just ask the first one. Mohammed Ben Marzoug from Carleton. Given the differences in resolution and wavelength between Veritas and Magellan datasets, how can researchers effectively compare these datasets to detect potential surface changes on Venus over the long period between the two missions?
Yeah, well, so that's exactly why we designed the Iceland field campaign and, worked with DLR to acquire those data sets. So we collected both X-band and S-band data, and we were there simultaneously taking the permittivity and roughness data. So, there are equations and well-known processes for going between X and S-band, but we want to use our field campaign data to validate that approach. And, it should be clear that also that, not both Magellan and Envision are S-band, but they're not the same wavelength either. I mean, it's Magellan is 12, Envision is 9, and Veritas is 3 to 4 centimeters. So none of them are exactly the same. Obviously, Magellan and Envision are closer in their band wavelength, but that's what we're doing with the field campaign that we planned in Iceland and took all that data. So, there'll be papers forthcoming which we will use to validate those approaches.
Hi, my name's Scott Peterson. I'm from the University of Arizona. And I had another question for Gallardo. I saw very briefly on your last slide, you mentioned using, there was a block of text that seemed to imply using modeling to take the dielectric constant and backscatter properties of wet soil and model them as dry soil. I was wondering if my interpretation of that was correct, and if so, what's sort of involved in that modeling of moisturizing soil? Thanks.
Sorry, it was very fast. Yeah. So the idea, at least in general terms, is surface depends on roughness, topography, and the electric properties. Of course, the FSAR data is imaging that area on Earth, so it's wet. Let's say you can take samples, go to the lab, try to compute the permittivity of the samples, and that will give you an estimate of the dry permittivity. But you also, the real SAR images on FSAR data are, they have the wet component. And both are interesting because that would be the one you see in FSAR, but if you're the dry one, maybe you can simulate more venous conditions. So I think both approaches are important. If you want to use the data you have from the ground on Iceland to compare it with FSAR, for instance, you need to take into account all these wet components and put it on different models, and then you can compare it. If you don't want to do that.
Yeah, there's a talk on Friday about the permittivity, because we took permittivity data in place during the campaign to deal with that kind of issue. So we can do it by measurement and validate the models. Thank you.
This is a second online question from Mohammed Ben Marzoug from Carleton. It's for Noam. What factors, other than those you talked about, could cause changes in emissivity observed by the Parker Solar Probe during its Venus flybys? For example, could high or low emissivity anomalies be the result of existing geologic features or atmospheric phenomena?
Great question. Yeah. So the answer is yes. While the majority of the surface signal comes from thermal emissivity and is therefore correlated very highly with topography, if you subtract that out, which we do by using Magellan topographic models, and you subtract out at least an empirical model for the oxygen air glow, what you end up with is a residual that is due to likely neither of those things. Some of that's going to be due to mismatch of the images with the map, so we have to be careful about edge effects. But in some areas, and we saw this in the Avda region in flybys 3 and 4, there are some, for example, lava flow areas where we have differences in the received signal that don't appear to be correspondent with topographic variation in two different lava flows. This may be, for example, a different weathering state in the lava flow. It could be different grain size. It could be even compositional difference. And one of the things that we are working on now that we have this full set that we're going to integrate into different kinds of tests for different kinds of lava flows, we're hoping to be able to do enough deconvolution of those signals to determine whether or not there are either compositional variabilities or other surface variabilities, and or also in these residuals, if they're kind of smudgy and non-specific, perhaps that is our atmospheric variabilities that aren't simply a uniform air glow feature. So there could be different kinds of cloud densities, and so there's a whole bunch of things that we're working to deconvolve when we subtract out the known and model data sets. So the answer is yes, and we're working on that now with the three different flybys.
Gal Kashali, NASA Goddard. I have a question for the last speaker as well. So as far as I understand, your collection of radar data and topographic data is not simultaneous by quite a bit, right? So, but you're looking at roughnesses on length scale that go down to the millimeter level, centimeter to millimeter level. How reliable do you expect your results to be?
Well, good question. I expect to say check all possible roughness scales, okay? And then use models to compare them with what we actually see on the FSAR data. You're correct, they are not simultaneous, as you say. So potentially, especially the term of the electric properties, for instance, may have changed. And they were the same season, same place. Yeah. So there will be some variability in that. In the end, that's more, it's like sort of ground truth to understand, to a certain extent, what are the scales of roughness, especially in topography, that affect the backscatter. What I was trying to show mainly was the methodology between Magellan and radar data, which can be in Iceland, can be in many locations, and we intend to build, over the years. The ground data is more to try to understand the scattering process itself. It's still very preliminary. We went this August, so I only have initial results. Maybe next year we'll have more. I can tell you for sure how certainty we are of our measurements.
Just a very quick follow-up. Yeah, just I want to underline the fact that if you're looking at like 3 centimeters wavelength data, and in the meanwhile you have alien processes and man-made changes to the land, at that point the topography really becomes different from when the radar data has been collected.
Yes.
Tracy Gregg, University at Buffalo. I have two questions and I'm happy to ask one and then go to the end of the line and ask my other one. My first question is about terrestrial analog studies. A lot of the radar behaviors that we see on subaerial lava flows are related to porosity, which is related to degassing and vesicle content. Submarine lava flows, however, are at the approximate same surface pressure as we expect Venusian lava flows to be. And in submarine environments, the textures, both at a micro scale to at a millimeter scale to a centimeter scale to meter to kilometer scale, have really different textures and behaviors than those on land. And so I'm wondering if there's going to be any efforts to look at the behaviors of submarine volcanism and submarine products as analogs, potential analogs for Venusian surfaces.
Yeah, so obviously it's tough to get radar data there, but it certainly would be of value to look at the roughnesses. And, you know, that's the great thing about this data set. We're acquiring the roughness, acquiring the permittivity, so we can take into account individual aspects. So that's certainly a worthwhile thing to do.
Thank you. I will point out that most shipboard C-beam sonar, by the time the sonar beam reaches the seafloor, it ends up having a sound wavelength of 2.5 centimeters. So that's kind of fun.
Good point.
Hannes Bernhardt, University of Maryland. This is for both Richard and Susan concerning mapping efforts for Unveiled data. So once we finally have the data in 10 odd years, are there plans, or do you potentially envision concerted quadrangle-based geologic mapping efforts like they have been done for the Dawn mission on Sirius and Vesta, or just Degree 4 Messenger? But unlike, for example, in any recent times, at least for the Moon and Mars, where we never had a recent quadrangle-based mapping effort, quadrangle like that, a comprehensive concerted effort. Are you planning something like that for Veritas, like to repeat all the quadrangle mappings with Veritas data, for example?
So yes, we are, and we're starting to think about ways to build a cooperation to do that with USGS and with other mapping groups, and we're also starting to look at machine learning approaches, because there's already too many faults in Magellan to map every single one and still keep your sanity. So those are some of the topics that are covered in some of the presentations I listed, some of the posters for this evening. So yeah, it's very important, and we're also really pushing to get the quadrangle maps completed for Venus. That it still hasn't been completed. So yeah, it's a value to both do them now and redo them.
There you go. And just from our kind of the mapping side, where we were doing this 1 to 500,000 scale mapping, which is much less than the quadrangle map scale, we've been doing stuff to focus on features. So we're not kind of arbitrarily, we're trying to cut a complete feature, Atla Regio or Beta Regio, or, sort of by region. And so it's, and we're trying to do that in great detail. And one of the things we've been finding is also we're mapping zillions of fractures, which in many cases, which you think are Graben-Fisher individuals, 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 of these features in one of our map areas, and spending the effort to try and look at them in a systematic way in terms of trend and developing, I think, quite plausible radiating and broader circumferential and that sort of pattern. So actually, even with the current data, and we can only imagine what's possible when we have the Veritas data, even with the current data, we can develop remarkable geological stories for each thing in terms of, huge radiating swarms. It was a surprise to us that Ophidia was able to track a single graben, a unique graben, but you wouldn't have to do it unless you were really looking close, for 3,700 kilometers. And so we think that there's still a lot to be done from the Magellan data using the kind of detailed fractures. And we can only imagine what's possible when we get the full next generation Veritas data.
Okay, so we are out of time for questions. Thank you so much for all of our speakers again.
poster sessions for Evergy. So come see Afida and I for a little flyer.
Alrighty. So for those of you who just came in, welcome back to the Venus Unveiled Hot Planet Cool Science. Our next speaker is going to be Diogo Lorenzo, who will give us a talk on the relation between Venus lowland plains and I'm going to guess highland plains. Highland tesserae.
That's right. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the chairs and the moderator. It's my first LPSC. I'm really excited to be here showing you some of my work, which is pretty preliminary at this point. Okay, so this is probably not anything new for most of the people here, but generally we can divide the surface of Venus into two parts, okay? The lowlands and the highlands. And so if you look at the topography map of Venus, you see that most of it is in blue shaded areas, so that's negative or low topography. And this is what we call the lowlands. So they're dominated by volcanic plains, and it has been suggested that in some places they are basically cut into discrete blocks, and they seem to jostle and move akin to pack ice. And this matches well this sort of Plutonic squishy which comes out of more theoretical mantle convection numerical models, where you have the surface that is split or broken by intrusion into different blocks or small plates, and these plates move, and as they move in between each other, you're going to have deformation and surface velocities. The other part, of Venus is, of course, the highlands. They have high topography. They're mostly covered by this tesserae material, which are older terrains. They are very deformed, and they comprise about 7% of the surface of Venus. So this is about like this, the red shaded areas that you see here, okay? And so in our work, what we're trying to see is, if you have the lowlands that, have this sort of deformation, then you have these very perfect highlands or tesserae-dominated highlands. First of all, what is the composition and sizes that would allow these tesserae-covered highlands to persist for long periods of time, something like 1 billion years? And second of all, what is the relation between the highlands and the lowlands? And so to study this, we're going to use numerical models. We run about 50 mantle convection evolution models. They're linked to a core evolution model. In this case, I'm going to be showing 2D spherical annulus, which is in practice just a cut through the equator. And this is because in the beginning of the study, we want to run a lot of models to test the parameter space. And then we're going to introduce these continent-like domains, which, just analogous to tesserae-covered islands. And we're going to be testing one block, which is the red here, or 3 blocks. Furthermore, we're going to test different thicknesses for these highlands. So, it's 20 kilometers. It's really thin. You can barely see it. 100 kilometers, and then we're going to also test something that would be more likely a continent on Earth, which involves a thin continental crust, and then a root that is much thicker and has increased density and viscosity. And finally, we're also going to test different rheologies, both for the lowlands and the highlands. So in terms of the lowlands, this is going to range from basalt, olivine basalt, to plagioclase, which is an anorthite. This has been found by Anna Gulcher, for example, that it's better or manages to model coronas with more accuracy. And finally, we're going to be testing different highland rheologies. This is based on a recent paper by Nemo and Mackwell. So we're going to be testing diabase, dry and white anorthite, and granite. Okay, so as I said, it's pretty preliminary results, and in 10 minutes can't show too much. So if you want to discuss more, just find me around. I'm here all week, or send me an email. And I'm going to be focusing in the next slides what is the composition and the original dimensions of these tesserae-covered islands that allow them to persist for long periods of time. So I'm going to show you a movie of evolution, if it works. But the idea is that we're going to have 3 blocks. You can't really not see them very well, but I wrote continental crust here, but this is really, like a block or a highland block or something like that. So you have temperature, you have island, you have basalt. If it's dark blue, it means aspergite, depleted mantle. If it's red, it's basalt. Viscosity, and then what is important is that the lowlands are basaltic and the islands have dry anorthite. And so, okay, it's working, that's good. But what you see is, first of all, you have plumes that, come from the top of the core mantle boundary. You form a basaltic crust. You can see there's a lot of delaminations and drippings. It's a really dynamic system, quite stochastic. And what you see is that, over time, these little blocks just start dispersing. And especially when you have this more intense times where you have like almost more akin to like overturns, basically your blocks just really disappear over time. And it makes sense. I mean, they're only 20 kilometers thick, so they pretty thin. And so the idea is that you can't really sustain them over time at the surface of the planet unless you had much more in the past. And so then you could get to this 7%. What I'm showing here, so this is just the model that I just shown you. What you have is basically, so in azimuth, in black, this is the block. And then, so this is azimuth that is around the surface of the planet. And then over time, so from 0 to 1 billion years. So what you see is that these blocks will be, coalesce for maybe 100 million years. And then I hope you can see the bottom here. This is the RMS surface velocity. So you see there is always some surface velocity. This is characteristic of a squishy lid over time. But you see there is some episodes of more, like higher velocities. This is more akin to like overturns. But what you see is that really this, the blocks really eventually will disappear. There's really small pieces at the surface. If you have a plagioclase lowland, in fact, this is a more deformable crust. So you see that the velocities are higher. This is a log scale, so it's pretty significant. And what is interesting is that basically, I mean, it doesn't stay cohesed, these blocks, for very long. But what's also interesting is that you see that parts of this top block and parts of this medium block will merge and form smaller blocks that evolve over time. So you can really have these things breaking apart and getting together again. And in this case, what's controlling it is actually the rheology of the lowlands and not the highlands. In terms of the influence of the highland composition, so what I'm showing here is the survival time of these blocks, or part of these blocks at the surface of the planet, again for 20 kilometers thick blocks. And I'm showing for 1 block or 3 blocks for different highland rheologies, diabase, dry anortite, granite, and white anortite, and for different lowland rheologies, so plagioclase and olivine basalt. And what you see, so for darker shades, it means that it lasts longer at the surface of the planet. And so what you see is that for 3 blocks, actually the survival times increase. So the survival is favored by a greater number of initial blocks. Of course, these are 3. If you have many more, this of course changes. But the idea is that if you have this process is so stochastic, that it's so dynamic, that if you have more blocks, it might be that part of the planet experiences less deformation, and so you can keep that block for a longer time. Also, the survival is favored by olivine basalt, because basically it experiences less constant deformation over time. And then it's harder to identify trends for the composition of the highlands. I mean, there's a lot more work that needs to be done here, but in general, weaker rheology, such as granite and wet anortite, seem to make these blocks last longer at the surface of the planet, in relation, of course, to the lowlands and the dynamics of the lowlands. And finally, I'm going to show you another movie. This is for a 1 block. It's 100 kilometers thick, so it's pretty much thicker. Plagioclase lowlands and diabase highlands. And you see the same plumes develop. You start getting this very dynamic crust that is, you have overturns and blocks. And what is interesting is that from 1 block that was here, it just splits apart. And then it starts moving as different blocks around the surface of the planet. And depending on what is the regional dynamics, you see what's really interesting is that this is going to merge again into 1 block. I hope you can see it from the back, but you see it was all dispersed and now it's merged again into 1 block, and now it's dispersed again, and part of it will just disappear, will just be carried to the mantle, into the mantle. But what's interesting is that you can, of course, for a thicker, more material block, this allows you to, these things to survive much longer at the surface of the planet. Okay, so the conclusions. The first one is really obvious. If you have thicker islands, more material, they last longer at the surface of the planet. And particularly when they're supported by deep keels. I didn't show you this, but it's more Earth-like, so they're more stable. However, even patches of thin blocks can survive hundreds of millions of years. And this, this is true as they can be dispersed and moved around. And even for thick initial blocks of maybe just 10 kilometers. The second one is that the composition and rheology of both the lowlands and highlands play an important role in their evolution. So not just the composition of the highlands, matter for their evolution over time, but also what is the rheology of the lowlands and the evolution of the crust of the planet. And finally, and this was very obvious in this last movie, the mantle dynamics can really drive movement, aggregation, fragmentations of the highland blocks over time. So it's a really integrated system, and it's a lot of work to be done still, so stay tuned. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Paul Byrne, who will be talking to us about the tectonics of Aphrodite Terra.
Condensation. By the way, if anybody does get bingo, I'm giving you my permission in this talk. Please shout out bingo, okay, if we hit those words. Okay, so the purpose of this talk is to share kind of a synthesis of work that some of you have heard versions of this before. We've brought some of this to LPSC in the past, but the goal here is to sort of synthesize a lot of this together and kind of tell you where we're going. And the shorter answer is, this is sort of giving the TLDR part of it, right? That we think there's plate tectonic-like processes having operated in Venus in the past. So let me build in and kind of get the thing starting by talking about the highlands. I'm principally talking about Venus's highlands. And as Diogo said, you can grossly morphologically or physiographically break Venus down into highlands and lowlands. And there's two particularly large highlands I want to draw your attention to. There's Ishtar Terra there on the top, and there's Aphrodite Terra here near or low latitude in the Eastern Hemisphere. There's a bunch of other areas that are elevated. Two I want to point out are Thales Regio, which I'll mention in a few minutes, and Alpha Regio, I'll show you in the next slide. And there's also a few other little things I want to point out. There's also some other high-standing terrain that is different that I'm going to skip for good reasons. But I also want to point out, too, that even within Aphrodite Terra, this area itself collectively is the size of South America. So there are parts to it that are basically composed of smaller regions, including Manitum Tessera, and Obda Regio and Thetis Regio. You'll see those names too. Do you need me to go over to the mic? Yeah. All right. So anyway, the idea, this is like those old game show guys who used to do it like in the 70s. Okay, all right, so there's highlands, okay? Okay, now, those highlands are in the main covered in or surfaced in, and honestly, I don't know what verb to use because we don't know the nature of this material, a material we call tessera. And this is a quick primer on tessera. This is what they look like. You've heard these mentioned already. Sue showed some images of them. Diogo talked about them. But this is a chunk of Alpha Regio on the western flank, a place where Da Vinci is going to go and take photos of. But a few things you need to know for tessera. They are generally strongly deformed terrain. They show lots of evidence of tectonic deformation. They've got a high radar backscatter, which is consistent with the idea that they've been tectonically reworked. And we have a whole pile of gaps because the Magellan data, although good, are not complete for the planet. This is a global map of the tessera shown here. It's all this kind of colorly stuff from the Ivanov Head 2011 map. It's dominantly located in the northern hemisphere, but principally, and the point I want to bring home to you is that a lot of the highlands are covered in this tessera material. Now, there is lots of work being, well, that's a lie. There's been some work done in the last 20 years to document the prospect for large-scale lateral motion on Venus. And that's kind of where the core of this talk gets to. Because the idea is that there are very few places in the solar system, except for Earth, where we have documented geological structural evidence for stuff having moved vast distances. But there are places on Venus, like up near in Ishtar Terra, there's a thing called Lakshmi-Planum, which structurally, in a paper by Harris and Badar 10 years ago, very credibly makes the case that it looks like indentar tectonics. It looks like India smashing up into Tibet and pushing stuff off to the side. And a neat paper by Marty Gilmore and Jim Head a few years ago showed that there are different tectonic fabrics adjacent to one another in Thales Tessera, which is consistent with those bits having developed those fabrics in different places under different stress fields and then somehow come together. Now, they didn't really get into the whole thing of how that coming together might have happened, but the structural observations and the mapping in that work are pretty solid. Now, something we've been talking about, and I've brought this to LPSC a couple of years ago, is visiting the prospect that the interiors of these highlands might be redolent of the cores of continents on Earth, which are called cratons. Locally, you may know them as cratons, but like I said last year, I'm not going to use that word. The point is that if this is a radar SAR image of Nunavut in Canada, and the characteristic of continental interiors, where it's not covered by vegetation and crap like that, is it's strongly deformed terrain, it has a high radar backscatter, and there are low-lying areas, which in this case are filled in by water. But I want to be very clear about this. These fracture patterns, and if you actually can get the eye in, there's all these kind of eroded folds. This is extremely tectonically deformed. It's planed down, and that water is ponding in basically synclines. There's a big fold pattern, and there's a bunch of fracturing. That's what basically the interior of Earth's continents look like. About 8% of the surface of Earth is covered in these cratons, and they are all associated with areas of thicker crust. And about 7% of the surface of Venus are covered in tessera, and they are all associated with thicker crust, at least the highlands are. So it raises the possibility that there is some kind of not just morphological similarity, but a kinematic and even perhaps dynamic similarity between how continents have grown on Earth and how Venus's highlands have come together. That's basically the idea we're trying to explore. Now, we've been working to get this paper published, and I hope we'll have it out this year, where we've made the case that in the modern era, whatever that is for Venus, I have no idea, but certainly since the late Age bombardment anyway, there are places where the highland edges, the perimeters of the highlands, have been deformed and have basically managed to effectively accrete or incorporate adjacent smooth plains material, the dominantly radar smooth material, which is probably dominantly lava. And by doing detailed structural analysis, we can find that there are tectonic patterns and fabrics inside the plains that they get deformed into ridges. And then as we move to the tessera margin, those ridges continue, but they get thicker and wider, but the strike continues. And then deep inside the tessera themselves, that same gross scale large tectonic fabric is present. And that is consistent with the foreland fold and thrust belts we see on Earth, where there is a gradient of strain. And what that would mean, if we're right, is that this stuff and that stuff, and I know you probably can't see the laser at home, but I'm saying from box 3 to box 1, might all be the same stuff and might not be that different in age. But the reason they look different is because of the deformation, because radar doesn't tell you lithology. It just tells you how much deformed it is. So this is a possibility, right? This is happening in the geologically recent epoch because it is deforming geologically recent plains. And there's a really interesting abstract that gets to the question of the interiors of these highlands. And this is an LPSC abstract from 31 years ago by Chadwick and Schauber. And to my knowledge, they never wrote this up. And if they did, and you know it, tell me. Because what they did was they drew this very high-level schematic map of different tectonic domains inside Avda. And so a couple of months ago, I crudely georeferenced it to the radar data we have from Magellan. And I'm going to zoom in on one place where there's many of these lines. But I'm going to zoom in real quick in this area down here in southeastern Avda. And this is what you see. You see contrasting tectonic fabrics. You have this weird kind of like egg carton-y fold interference pattern-y looking thing, which, by the way, looks very similar to things we see in Norway, which again is a function of fold interference, large-scale tectonic deformation of old rocks. But over this bit here, you don't really see that kind of crisscrossy pattern. You see more of a linear pattern. And between them, there's a different set of linear patterns here, which is consistent with, looks like eroded fold trains. And a fold train is a bunch of folds put together and then planed off. This is the sort of almost archetypal thing you see when chunks of formerly separated rock are pushed together on Earth. Now, this is an example, again, from Nunavut. This is radar data from Sentinel. And what you see here are two contrasting tectonic fabrics that look different. The radar backscatter is different, and you can see fold patterns in one and not in the other, not so well. But this thin blue line, which is about as thin as a river, I measured it on Google Maps, it's about 50 meters across, is a suture zone between an area that's Meso or Neo-Archean and one that's Cambrian. There was an entire ocean between these two bits, and now they're touching and they're separated by a river. So I want to emphasize to you that when we push together things on Earth, you can end up with very, very narrow zones where there was once an ocean in there. Well, let's go back to an area where we saw a minute ago in Southeast Avda. This is our area here. We have contrasting tectonic fabrics in this really broad area. Look at the scale bar. This whole region is about 500 kilometers across. This is a much smaller area in central Algeria. We have rocks here and rocks there that actually don't have that disparate tectonic fabric, but there is an area of low-lying material. Now, I don't have a SAR image because I didn't have time to make it because, like you, I probably uploaded my talk about 20 minutes for the deadline last Wednesday. But the point is that this area here is an eroded set of fold trains in the suture zone. And on the basis of work that's been done on Earth, we know this is a terrain boundary because the rocks on this side are near Proterozoic, and they're intrusives that are eroded, and they're sediments that are Precambrian. And there's a very narrow zone separating them because in that narrow zone was once an ocean. Now, a graduate student working with me, Lauren Rochford, is giving a talk in Waterway 4 at 9:35 tomorrow morning, where she'll detail more of this structural mapping for Africa. So I heartily encourage you to go there. But the take-home message I want to leave with you is this. We find morphological and structural evidence for plate tectonic-like processes assembling the highlands in Aphrodite Terra. Now, I have 40 seconds left, so I'm going to tell you a little pro tip. There's nothing that's going to trigger a geophysicist more who studies ancient Earth by saying plate tectonics and leaving the room. Because that phrase means different things to different people, which is why I've qualified it by saying plate tectonic-like. Archean Earth did not have plate tectonics as we had today, simply because the heat flow is higher. But I can see what it did. It had the ability to take disparate rocks with different deformational histories and push them together extremely effectively, closing ocean basins and moving them to hundreds to thousands of kilometers. Whatever process operated in the Archean on Earth, we contend, should be considered as the mechanism that made the highlands on Venus. 1 minute there, I'm gone.
Perfect timing. All right. So the next talk will be given by Alyssa Mills. The title of the talk is Nature of Rifting on Venus Revealed by Gravity-Derived Crustal Thickness.
Hello all, there we go. Hello all, my name is Alyssa Mills. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at Baylor University, and today I'll be sharing my results from my crustal thickness models and revealing the nature of rifting on Venus. An example of some rifts is shown here on the screen of Somerville crater and the rifts going through in the Beta Regio. There we go. So now when we look at the surface of Venus, we see a vast array of different geological features like coronae, tesserae, rift zones, or chasmata. I'm helping your bingo cards also. Some of these examples are shown here, but not all of them. But we can come to the conclusion that Venus has a rich tectonic history, but we still don't really understand how these different geological features are being made. We're really missing that link between the surface and the interior. And gravity can help us bridge that gap to link the surface in the interior. But there is a caveat in using gravity in order to resolve these surface features. When you're using gravity, we have to keep in mind that when we're looking at surface features, these are very small in a spatial length. So in order to resolve smaller spatial lengths, you have to have a much higher gravity resolution, a much higher gravity degree, or L. So the screen now shows from Konoplev et al. In 1999, the gravity map from Magellan. The different contours are showing the different degree strengths. So what we're seeing here is that gravity degree resolution varies geographically. The highest resolution areas are within the equatorial region, which is also shown here in green, and then also within the northern pole for Ishtar Terra. So while this is concerning that unfortunately our highest resolution areas are only in certain geographical regions, we can still resolve certain geological features. One of the most interesting ones, in my opinion, are the rift zones. Rift zones are particularly important in understanding Venus's tectonic history and the thermal evolution. We can actually see a good majority of those rift zones within this highest resolution area. And some of those are within the famous Beta Atla-Themis region, or the BAT region, but it doesn't encompass all of them, sorry. So the BAT region is over here, and it also extends outside of the resolution area and then onto the other side. So some of these rift zones are within this highest resolution, but what we really want to understand is the nature of rifting. So whenever we think of rifting, we usually think in the most traditional sense, it's extensional tectonics, and this is where the crust is thinning. But actually, you can really learn about the interior from rifting. And we can really learn about what is the nature of rifting by looking at the MOHO. So we can use gravity-derived measurements or the actual observations to then look at what is the state is the MOHO in. So there's 3 different states that the MOHO could be in. It could be in the isostatic state. So if you have crustal thinning, then you expect that your MOHO should then be amplified right under the rift valley. While that may be a great case, not all the time the geology works like how we want it to in physics. And we have the sub and super isostatic cases. So the sub-isostatic case is where the actual measured MOHO, the gravity-derived MOHO, is a lot less than that from the isostatic. This could be indicative of viscous relaxation, and maybe that you have a dormant state where there's no active rifting. Now, the opposite is the super isostatic case, where the actual measured MOHO is a lot larger than that from the isostatic. So this could be indicative of active rifting. So what we've done to actually characterize the nature of rifting on Venus within these highest gravity resolution areas is that we use a 2-pronged approach. We create 2 different models to get the MOHO relief and crustal thickness, one from gravity and one from isostasy. So the gravity-derived model is simply just using the 1-layer crustal thickness model. This is outlined in the Wazorek and Phillips 1998 Moon paper. And then the isostatic models are simply from like your geodynamics textbook. And also within this Wozorek paper, there is a filtering to handle attenuation. This filtering is also applied to the isostatic models. That way we can do a direct comparison to actually look at what is the state of the MOHO. What you can see here now is not the MOHO in the background, but topography, but what I wanted to show are the different profiles. So what I've done is I have mapped profiles within all the rift zones within the highest gravity resolution areas and extracted MOHO reliefs and crustal thicknesses. So there's an example for Davana Chasma, 15 different profiles. I know some look kind of wonky, but that's A-okay. But you can also see that these profiles are much larger than the rift zones, about 1,400 kilometers. This is so I can also look at the surrounding regions to get a little bit more geological context. Eventually we'll go, there we go. So now these are the 15 different profiles that have been extracted for Davana Chasma in the dashed lines in the background. We do this stacking to maximize the signal to noise because we're really pushing the limit of the gravity data. And what I've done after taking all this raw data is then average it. So that is the solid green line that you're seeing. And then the vertical lines are showing the extent of the MOHO, and the vertical dotted dash lines are the very edges, while the Rift Valley is the solid black line. So the real meat of this is comparing the gravity-derived MOHO versus the isostatic MOHO. So for the gravity-derived MOHO, that is the measured MOHO, that is in solid green once again, but also now we have the isostatic MOHO. So what I want first everyone to look at is just within the rift zone. So we're simply just going to look at the amplitude within the rift zone. So if we look at the gravity-derived MOHO, we can see that this amplitude is really small. It's really honestly flat for both Davana Chasma and Hecate Chasma versus the amplitude for the isostatic. So this is telling us that within the BAT region, a majority of the rift zones are in a sub-isostatic state. This could mean that we have a dormant state where perhaps we don't have active rifting within the rift zones here. Also plotted here is the average topography in case you don't believe that these are actually rift zones, but they also are plotted at the top. But also now let's look outside the rift zones. So outside the rift zones, we can see within the MOHO relief from the gravity derived, so the green line, that we have this larger in amplitude that's happening outside of the rift zone. So this is indicative that we have crustal thickening. So let's make it more evident by having a little shaded figure. So this excess of crustal material is telling us perhaps, maybe, we have a lot of intrusive magmatism. So intrusive magmatism can be in the form of, say, dikes, sills, or batholiths. And when you have this intrusive magmatism, this can actually also, again, drive the extensional tectonics. So you can drive rifting through the intrusive magmatism. That material has to go somewhere, and it's going to push material out. Now, because we're seeing crustal thickening and also seeing that this intrusive magmatism is most likely occurring, that this is supporting the plutonic squishy lid regime, which is schematically shown on the right. Now, a little caveat about my work is that we could only look at the rift zones within what we term as the inactive regions. So if you've never seen this plot from Galchard et al. In 2020, what they've done is they termed inactive regions as being the white, and then the active regions being in the red. So we have only looked at rift zones within these inactive regions, so we can't do any direct comparisons between rift zones between these two different regions. But eventually we will have Veritas, which will be able to resolve those higher degree strengths in order to look at all the different rift zones and at a much smaller spatial scale. So it's going to be not only looking at 180 kilometers, but down to, I think, about 100 kilometers in spatial length. But our next step is to do some numerical modeling to reproduce these different rift zones and looking at if you have a bunch of intrusive magmatism driving this extensional tectonics. So if you have any questions about the work that we've done so far, please ask me during the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So our next talk will be given by Ian Flynn on channelized lava flows on Venus, new insights into distribution, morphology, rheology, and emplacement processes.
Technical difficulties on the walk up there. My apologies. You already heard the title, so I'm going to dive into this, and I want to start by thanking my co-authors, Mike Ramsey, David Crown, and Kyle Ashley for their continued assistance with this work. So this work is being supported through a NASA Solar System Workings Program awarded to Mike Ramsey in 2024, and there are three distinct aspects to this project: constructing a Venus channelized flow catalog, thermodynamic modeling, and thermorheologic modeling. Now, each of these individual aspects of the project could be their own 10 to 15-minute presentation. I'm going to try and condense all three down to a 10-minute talk. So I'm happy to explain things further during the Q&A, as well as going to questions outside. Now, before I get into the interesting science and results we've gotten so far, I need to kind of set the table on what we're looking at, and that's channelized lava flows. Not canali, not sinuous rills, constructive channelized lava flows. When we observe them on Venus, you're seeing an example on the top right screen there of one southwest of Appy Mons. They have a defined central channel with constructed lateral levees that we interpret that central channel by its radar dark return and then the levees as a brighter return adjacent to it. Now, when we see this flow morphology on Earth, that is typically representative of the active central channel, example from the 2022 Mauna Loa eruption that acts as the primary transport mechanism from the lava from the vent to the flow front, with then darker constructed levees adjacent to it. Now, this specific flow morphology is indicative of higher effusion rates, moderate to higher pre-flow topography, and those two factors also indicate both higher flow velocity typically. And this flow morphology is usually only in place during the early stages of an eruption. So we see it in the first early days to form and then remain throughout the life of the eruption. So again, when we're talking about channelized lava flow, this is the flow morphology we're talking about. Now, jumping right into it, about a year and a half ago, we presented initial results of our survey across the surface looking for this specific flow morphology. I'm pleased to announce we've completed our initial survey using the Left-Look Global Magellan Mosaic and identified approximately 515 channelized lava flows across the surface of Venus, indicated on this chart by the yellow circles. That yellow square in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll hear more about that region later. But again, we have completed the initial survey. We're going to go back and cross-check the results, make sure none were missed, as well as misidentified. For those in the audience, you can begin to see some spatial analysis and clustering around certain volcanic centers. We are in the process of performing that type of geospatial analysis as well, but those results to come later. Now, highlighting some of the flow morphologies we're seeing across the surface here, we have three examples from the catalog. I want to pay particular close attention to the bottom two numbers on each of these inset images. That second to last one is the observable flow length, and the last one is the observable flow area. Now, to contextualize these numbers for you, typically when we see this type of flow morphology on Earth, the observable flow length is anywhere from maybe 5 to 15, 20 kilometers in length. And then the observable flow area, what it'll cover, might be anywhere from 10 to 15 kilometers squared. And then entire lava flow fields from some of the recent eruptions we've seen in Hawaii and Iceland usually are anywhere between 20 kilometers squared to 80 kilometers squared. We're working with individual single channelized lava flows that are several hundred to several cases over 1,000 kilometers squared in area. So just keep that size in mind when we continue through this talk about how big of a lava flows we're seeing and finding on Venus. Now, for a subset of those flows identified in the VCFC, we're doing additional, more detailed flow morphology analysis, morphometry, and other additional kind of similar analysis on them. These are prioritized into two regions or classes: the flows within the stereo DEM coverage and flows within high surface emissivity regions. Now, for the stereo DEM coverage, that's the highest resolution topography we have on the planet, so it'll provide us with better topography data sets. And for the surface emissivity data set, those could be evidence of some of the youngest geologic or volcanic activity we see on the surface. Now, an example of that regions we're showing is Mertziger Mons there, and many of the channelized lava flows we found at these high emissivity regions correlate with the moderate to higher surface emissivity locations, indicating they might be some of the youngest volcanic activity we see on the surface. And that bottom table is, again, an additional summary of some of the morphometric parameters we've gotten so far. Again, we have an additional approximately 35 Monses we're targeting with
going to expand that to corona as well at some point. Now, hard gear shift here, thermodynamic modeling. Initial work for this was presented in 2019 by Ashley and Ramsey in a publication where they were constraining the bulk rock chemistry and thermodynamic evolution of Venusian lavas using a Monte Carlo approach to constrain those wide error bars on that geochemical data. Now, that work relied on using simple solutions and some idealized solutions, my apologies, and not including all the volatiles and complicated petrologic processes that we might expect to see on Venus. In this project, we're focused on incorporating those non-idealized solutions, volatile content, some of the more complicated processes. Now, the initial results from this project are summarized there with crystallization rates as well as temperature and viscosity relationships. But the takeaway from it is that incorporating a small amount of volatile, specifically in this case H2O, and accounting for redox solutions, substantially changes the temperature viscosity relationship for the Venusian lavas and indicates that the lavas are sensitive to the inclusion of volatiles, specifically H2O, but less so to the redox state. Now, unfortunately, for the sake of time, I do need to make another hard gear shift to the last aspect of this project, which is thermoreologic modeling. So each of those previous two aspects I talked about, the channelized flow catalog, the thermodynamic modeling, and now the thermoreologic modeling, all will connect to each other. And I'll explain that on the last slide. But what we're proposing to do here is take flow measurements from that first task and eventually temperature viscosity relationships from that second task to perform the thermoreologic modeling using a Venus adapted version of the PyFlogo model published in 2023 to get eruption conditions and thermoreologic evolutions for the emplacement of Venusian lava flows, ideally to constrain cooling rates, emplacement durations and times to help give some observations for the upcoming missions, and just to further understand how long it takes to emplace these flows that are of a substantial size. So in this case, we tested the model or applied it to one of the lava flows southwest of Appy Mons, which is about a 45.7 kilometer long channel for this lava flow. We used measured flow dimensions from that lava flow, starting with an approximation of the depth, regional topography, and then rheologic inputs from a terrestrial analog, the Great Tobacek Fissure eruption. When I say rheologic inputs, I am meaning bulk rock density, starting viscosity, eruption temperature, things that we don't have well constrained for Venus, but we do for terrestrial analogs that we know compositionally match what to expect on Venus. Now, in order to use that model, all the input flow dimensions and reproduce that observed channel length required an diffusion rate of 129,000 meters cubed per second. Now, again, what does that value mean? It's a large number, but contextualizing it for what we typically see on Earth, usually to replace channelized lava flows about 15 to 20 kilometers in length requires diffusion rates in high hundreds, 500, 600, maybe towards 1,000, depending on other factors. We are several order of magnitude larger than that, but again, keep in mind, we're working with flows that are substantially larger in area and dimensions than what we see on Earth. Now, to summarize some of the takeaway points that we've done so far, channelized lava flows seem to be an abundant morphology across the surface of Venus correlated with primarily volcanic centers, Monses, and coronas, but we're doing additional work to get that geospatial analysis done. They are indicative or commonly identified in the high emissivity areas where that data is available, again, limited in that global coverage. Thermodynamic and thermoreologic modeling indicate the lava flows are sensitive to volatile content and require moderate to higher fusion rates to emplace them. The future and ongoing work that we're working on is to continue and expand the morphology study that we've started. There's approximately 35 Monses in that high priority region that I mentioned earlier. So there's quite a lot of lava flows to investigate and perform measurements on. We're also going to do geospatial analysis and clustering analysis on that VCSE catalog we have so far, as well as then do additional thermodynamic, thermoreologic modeling. And the ultimate goal for this project is, again, to constrain cooling rates as well as emplacement durations in order to assist observations for the upcoming missions. Thank you very much.
All righty, this is panel Q&A round 2. So all of the speakers who just spoke in this last block, could you please make your way to the stage? And for those of you who have questions, please make your way to the microphones in the front of the room, or for those of you remotely, please enter your questions in the Zoom Q&A. I'd like to remind everybody to please identify yourself and your institution as you're asking your question. Let's see, we got all 4 of them up there. Okay, let's get started.
Hi, Kirby Runyon, Planetary Science Institute. Question about the channelized lava flows. I was curious if there's evidence of where the channel could disappear and then reappear, indicating potentially a tube-fed flow.
This. We do not see any evidence. Oh, perfect. That was going to be loud, a lot of yelling. We don't see any evidence of, at least what we've looked at, of tube-fed flows. We do see what might be evidence of pivoted lava flows at times, which would then indicate multiple different phases of an eruption cycle. But we can go back again. We have 515. There might be some adjacent. Again, we had specific selection criteria where it had dark central channel, brighter lateral levees. There may be evidence of tube fed that we were just not particularly looking for, but I'm happy to take a look again at the catalog and report back if I see the feature you're looking at, but I cannot think of anything I've seen so far that would indicate a tube fed flow.
Thank you.
I have an online question for Paul. It's from John Chadwick, who says, thank you for using the very old Chadwick and Shaver abstract. Have you found evidence for topographic changes across those structural boundaries in Aphrodite?
So first off, John, thank you for your email, which I just got, and I'm absolutely going to follow up with you because this is great. So thank you for reaching out. We have not done an exhaustive topographic assessment of the area yet for 2 reasons. One is that I spend most of my time doing emails, so I'll get around to it. And the second reason is because the quality of data, and a lot of you in this room know this, but many of you may not know this, the quality of global data are not great. There are some places where we have higher resolution work that's stereo-derived data rather than the radar altimetry data that Robbie Herrick has put together, which is better. But more broadly, let me emphasize that when we get the global topography from Veritas and when we get the high-res stereo target data from Veritas and from Envision, it is going to be like when you got MOLA for Mars, and it is going to revolutionize things. So the shorter answer is no. The longer answer is we are going to.
Gerard, Imperial College. Brief question for Paul. You showed some potential Earth analogs of your interpretation of Tessera, like Norway, Canada, Algeria. So if you were to select one location for a dedicated Weiser-Venser airborne campaign, which one would that be?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question a slightly long way. So I want to emphasize to everybody here so you're not confused. Tessera is a word we do not use in geology on Earth. And it is simply a morphological descriptor term. And unfortunately, without meaning to, it has sort of often become a shorthand for a unit. But it is not any kind of unit beyond something morphological, a textual unit. Which is to say that there is no intrinsic reason that all the Tessera are the same rock or had the same deformation history or the same age or same, which means that, in my view, first off, when I consider Tessera, what I'm thinking of Greenland and northern Canada and Western Australia. I'm thinking of the very old continental interiors of Earth. The second thing is we know from those field sites on Earth that they are all different. They have all different lithologies and all different deformational histories. So there is not one unique place, which means if you can only do one, I will help you get more funding for us to do several sites because that is the truest way we can do this.
Right, thanks.
Hi, this is Anna Gulcher from the University of Bern in Switzerland. I have several questions for several authors, but I'm going to pick my battle considering this line. So I'd like to ask a question to Alyssa. I really enjoyed your talk, first of all, and I'm very excited of your future analysis of your hypothesis of intrusion-assisted rifting. My question is a little bit related to the data that you use for the analysis, because the crustal thickness maps are obviously derived from gravity, and gravity itself has, of course, as you have shown, this resolution limitation, sort of say, but also, in other words, it also has this error margin in actually of, I think, 10 milligauss. And I was just wondering how these two limitations. Spatial is quite straightforward, but if there's any way of how the amplitude error margin of the gravity field translates into that crustal thickness map, is that like sort of an error bar? This is, of course, the data is not yours, but I was just wondering if that's something you're thinking of to explore.
That is a great question. I haven't really thought about the error bars to the gravity. So it is originally the raw Magellan gravity data and then taking that Bouguer anomaly. So taking that surface topography as well. So it's all the raw data and then also doing the filtering method to take away, to do the downward attenuation. So I don't really know what the error would be for the gravity, but my advisor who is behind you could know. I may not be the best person to ask. I know I hate to like put it on someone who does know. But yes, I haven't thought about the uncertainty just yet. This is very preliminary work, to be honest. So, but it's very exciting. But yes, it would be a next step to look at to make sure that I incorporate everything.
Thank you.
Peter James, Baylor University. I have a question for Diogo about the keels. So I really like the idea that maybe keels contribute to the geoid on Venus. On Earth, they roughly are neutral buoyancy because of the trade-off between composition and temperature. But do you have a sense on Venus how the keels should manifest in terms of buoyancy?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I guess when I approach this, I just approach it in a very agnostic way, which is I'm going to try things. And the first thing I did when I run these models was to just have different thicknesses. And I noticed that it's really hard for them to survive. And so I just got inspired by the way people do this for the Earth, which is to have keels. It's really hard to control these things, especially because at those depths, it's not just you not just have diffusion creep, you start having dislocation creep. So controlling the viscosity contrast and the density contrast, it's really hard in these models. So I'm sorry, I don't know, but maybe you'll find out.
Hi, Cass Nicely, University of Alaska Fairbanks. First off, I have a comment for Alyssa and Diego. Good job on saying, I don't know. I wish there are more scientists that would admit that. Now, my actual question is for the last speaker, whose name I'm sorry I forgot. That number, that
Ian,
diffusion
yeah.
rate, 129,000 cubic meters per second. That is insanely high. So high that I have this paranoid worry that maybe the physics changes at that scale. Is there any like possibility or a concern of that?
Oh, 100%. This was a concern when, with the paper 2023 we put out, acknowledging some of the high fusion rates that were proposed in the early days of looking at the Venus data, that you essentially get into like jet engine fluid mechanics stuff. You lose all reasonability. What I will state is this is why we've gotten so far. I've caveated it. The flows we're looking at are huge, with starting channel dimensions of multiple kilometers, 5, 6, 8. So to sustain and develop a channel that large and wide, by just physical geology, you have to have a high fusion rate to generate it, keep it, sustain it, or what we would see post is little tiny channels, because they would get infilled and they would dwindle out. So they have to be large. But what is that number then? I don't know. Your point to the physics is very valid. And I will state that it is just a model. All models make assumptions of limitations. It could be wrong. We've done our best to account for all the environmental factors of Venus, but there could be stuff that we're just missing and need to improve upon. So that is something definitely we're keeping in mind, and not just hopefully putting those numbers out without all the caveats and understanding. But thank you for that. That is an excellent point to raise.
Thank you.
James Day, Scripps Institution of Oceanography. It's also for the last author. You make a comparison with modern Icelandic and Hawaiian volcanic eruptions. I think your comparison would be better with flood basalts. So the Rosa flow in the Columbia River is Miocene age, 16 million years, 40,000 square kilometers, 1,300 cubic kilometers, thought to have formed in 14 years. So that might be a better comparison. I was just wondering if you've thought about that at all.
Sorry, I'm not laughing. It was an excellent question. I'm laughing at the concept. I've started trying to compile the sizes of reported lava flows in fields in a separate catalog for Earth and some Mars ones to start doing some more detailed flow comparisons, because exactly the morphologies we're seeing of these flows of the central channel defined lateral levees is typically what we see recently for Icelandic, Hawaiian, Galapagos, Piton, all these, Russia, a lot of different sites, and they have the same morphology textures, just smaller. But looking at the flood basalts would be an excellent one to go see. I'm not as familiar if we see the defined central channel morphology. I know the sizes you're saying are good, but I don't know about could you speak to do we see that same morphology within those?
Go and take a look. There's quite a lot of work on these, so go and have a look. There are some of these central channels. I can't tell you exactly how big they are, but
I appreciate it. No, thank you. That's a very helpful comment.
Nick Wagner, Brown University. I have a question for Alyssa. I was curious about your sort of inversion philosophy. Since it's a one-layer inversion, do you consider any deeper signals in the mantle? And if not, do you correct for them so when you invert for your MOHO, you're not like contaminating your inversion at all? And then with the intrusive body like hypothesis, I think that's great to incorporate. Have you thought about developing maybe a more nuanced inversion to directly incorporate the influence of those to gravity and topographic uplift?
I want to answer the last question first. Unfortunately, no, not yet. We haven't considered it. Again, it's very preliminary. We really honestly came up with the idea of the intrusive magmatism being the strong case of why we're seeing the crustal thickening relatively recently. So any suggestions we are going to implement. Now, for your first question, the one-layered model is going to mostly have the MOHO dominating. So if I really wanted to look at the mantle, that's going to be mostly in a two-layered crustal thickness model, because this is going to dominate in those lower spherical monic degrees. So I think if I want to answer more questions about the mantle, the next step would be using a two-layered crustal thickness model. But the one-layer crustal thickness model is treating everything homogeneously for you have a layer of crust and you have a layer of mantle. So you can't learn too much about the mantle just with the one-layer crustal thickness model. So could always do a two-layered.
Right, but I guess since you're only interested in a one layer, do you correct for stuff happening in the mantle at all by like prescribing a low degree filter at all? Because I know you mentioned like the high degree filtering to get like the inversion stable, but I was curious if there was like a low degree like filtering technique you're using to sort of mask out mantle signatures.
So I honestly forget if the filter that's within that Wazork and Phillips paper also handles these smaller degrees. I thought it did both, to be honest, but it's something I will check just to make sure. But again, I don't really see maybe the need to do as much filtering because it is the one-layered model. Now, if it's a two-layered, yeah.
Cool, thanks. We can talk about more later.
Yes.
It's good work.
Thank you.
Hi, Alan Whittington, University of Texas at San Antonio. My question is for Ian. Actually, I was going to ask you the flood basalt question, but I'll add a part two to it, which is now that you've got your big collection of these big channelized flows, do you see spatial clustering? Like, what is producing all this lava? Could it be something analogous to flood basalt provinces? Do they look like they're different ages? So do you have like local clusters that are all, look similar but are different ages as you go to different parts of Venus, or where does it all come from?
Hi, Alan. Great question. So we got the data set shortly before LPSC, and I've done an initial spatial clustering analysis on it. And again, preliminary, need to go back and refine this, but they're typically correlated highest density around the Monses, as well as on the flanks of Corona. We see a lot of them. So then, these lava flows are indicative of certain emplacement, higher fusion rates, blah, blah, blah. Why do we see them on the flanks of Corona and around specific Monses? Does that mean just larger magma supply, all that stuff? I would probably say it's typical volcanism on Venus, just about commonly they are observed around Monses. They're not around giant rift centers or anything like that yet. But I'm still working on that spatial analysis. Once I get more, I'm happy to share the results and let you know.
Awesome. Thank you.
Could I jump in and just answer that question too by adding something to it? We don't know what geodynamic regime Venus is under. And if it's not doing seafloor spreading, but it's producing pound for pound the same amount of stuff that Earth is, it's going to be producing what we might consider large igneous provinces all the time. So that might simply be the why. Maybe.
Hi, this is Anna Goldshire again. This time a question for Diogo. Oh, yeah, now I see you. Hi. You showed some subtle differences between the survival of your highlands or cratonic-ish, material between the models with different rheologies. And I was just wondering whether these models also have a difference in survival rate of the original lowland material. And if you have not looked at that, what your expectation is, or if the lowland is not really resurfaced and it's only sort of the highland, which is torn apart. Of course, you would need a different field to look at the lowland survival, but.
Oh, okay, it's back. Yeah, good question. I haven't I haven't looked at that. I mean, I guess the way to do this would be to look at the age of the surface or eruption rates and just erupt over time. So this is possible to do. I haven't done it just because I was focusing on the highland survival. But you're absolutely right. That would be really interesting to control these models with having no highlands and seeing what the presence of islands does to the lowland.
Yeah, or just a ratio of if the whole model is resurfacing more, then maybe the survival of the highland only doesn't say you much in comparison to other models. So that would be interesting too.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Hi, Julia Maya, DLR. I have a question for Diogo as well, which is about, so I'm not a modeler, so maybe I'm thinking this wrong, but as far as I understand, when you have the surface mobilization, you have to set some yielding, right? So my question is if changing this parameter can affect the survival rates of the continents and if you played with that or not.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. In these models, generally we have a yield stress, which is just the stress really to break the surface and have some sort of subduction. In this squishily, the interesting thing is that even if you don't have yielding, just the fact that you have intrusion really weakens your surface and leads to these velocities and this sort of deformation. But yeah, I mean, we could play with the way that the lowlands, I guess in this case, break and deform. I haven't looked at it. This is just another free parameter that we can look at. I just really took a model that I thought was a good model where you have a mix of squishy lead and small semi-hemispherical overturns. But yeah, this would be another direction. Yeah, we'll make it a very long paper one day. Thank you for your question, though. Yeah.
I'm going to abuse my moderator's privilege to ask a question of Paul. So you say plate tectonic like. Do you think you could end up with those juxtaposed tectonic fabrics by something more subtle than just like an India-like collision, say just like a little stretch and then push back together?
I don't know. So that's another example of someone saying, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that on Earth, we do know that these areas, and for where we have paleomag data, we know they were very far apart. But they also have vastly different lithologies and vastly different tectonic histories, and they're side by side. We don't know anything about what this material is or what these blocks are made of, but at the same time, we see very high strain amounts. And here's the thing, let's say we're wrong, fine. But we do not see these patterns on any other solar system body, rock or ice, with maybe the exception of parts of Europa, maybe. That's it. Nothing in the inner solar system. So if it's not what the other large-sized rocky world had 3 billion years ago, then I'd like to hear your suggestions. But I don't know.
Hello, my name is Arij. I'm from the University of Texas at Dallas. Since we are comparing, this is mainly directed towards Dr. Byrne. Since we are comparing Venus to Earth, got me thinking about how on Earth most cratons have relatively low elevations, but the Kapval craton in southern Africa has an anomalously higher elevation. To my knowledge, it's because of a mantle superplume under southern Africa. What I'm wondering is how likely is it that we would see similar activity on Venus, where we have like a superplume under a craton that causes elevation uplift into Craton. Well, not Craton, Venus Highland.
The thing about it is, and one thing that I hinted at in the talk, but I did not explicitly say, so I'm going to explicitly say it now. If these things date from an era where stuff was moving at vast amounts, it was a totally different era. And on Earth, that was and is enabled by the presence of subduction, Pacific plate style and scale subduction, which means we're talking about a Venus that is not like Venus today, which is why I think a lot of this happened a very long time ago. So what we're seeing today might reflect what the mantle is doing today, but I think the assembly of these things dates from an era when things were very, very different. So the short answer is, sure, we know there are super plumes on Venus today. We know there's dynamically compensated terrain, highlands on Venus, but the big highlands that I'm talking about are not. They do not appear to be supported from something deep in the mantle. So that is to say that they may have simply formed in a totally different geodynamic regime.
Okay. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So if you have any more questions, please come after the session. You can always talk to the presenter.
After the session, there's a Venus mixer, which I know you're going to mention, but I want to say that I have a bunch of the Venus exploration strategy documents with me printed. So if you want one, I have about 15 of them, and first come, first served.
All right. Yes, let's thank the speakers again. Okay, so our next talk will be given by Anna Catalina Plessa. The title of the talk is The Present-Day Interior of Venus as Predicted by Global Geodynamical Models and Constrained by Observations.
All right. Hi, everyone. So today I'll talk about what we can predict in terms of geodynamical models and how we can use current and future observation in order to constrain this type of models. So when we look at the surface of Venus, we see that it's dominated by volcanic features at all spatial scales. So basically, this tells us that magmatism has played an important role over the entire history of the planet and perhaps still plays a major role today. And we see here a map of volcanic features. Volcanic features, so more than 85,000 volcanic edifices that have been mapped in this paper here by Han and Byrne in 2023. Now, we also have some information about the interior, although with very large uncertainties. So for the interior, we have estimates of the tidal lobe number K2 that have been determined by using tracking data from Magellan and Pioneer Venus. And what we will do here in this presentation is to basically look at how we can model this, the thermal evolution of Venus, and how we can estimate in terms of the tidal lobe number K2 that we can use then the estimates that we have from Magellan and Pioneer Venus. So how we are doing this, we're using a semi-analytical model based on the normal mode theory for radially stratified viscoelastic bodies. And the model uses pre-computed mineralogical tables that we pre-compute them with Perplex and an Andrade rheology. And another input that is important for this kind of models to compute the tidal deformation is the mantle viscosity. And we take the mantle viscosity from global thermal evolution models. And then what we see, what we compare with is the tidal lobe number K2, that we see again here with, these are the values that we have. And also in terms of the phase lag, we also calculate the phase lag, which tells us about the lag of the tidal deformation. However, this has never been measured for Venus. This is the goal for the future missions. We have some theoretically inferred values, but as I said, this has never been actually measured for the planet. Now, in terms of the geodynamical models, as I mentioned before, we are using these in order to determine the viscosity structure in the interior that then we use for the tidal deformation calculations. And the geodynamical models are fully 3D models that solve the evolution of mantle flow and of temperature over the entire history of Venus. They include temperature and depth-dependent viscosity, thermal expansivity, and thermal conductivity. And you see here profiles of the thermal expansivity from the surface to the core mantle boundary and of the thermal conductivity that are computed based on this initial temperature profile that you see here. In addition to that, our models also consider the effect of magmatism. And for this, we consider models with intrusive and extrusive magmatism. And this is kind of like, you know, the regime that Diogo was mentioning earlier, this plutonic squishy lid. So basically, if we have purely extrusive magmatism, the entire melt that is produced in the interior is instantaneously extracted at the surface where it cools and pushes down cold material that was originally located at the surface. And this has an effect of a strong cooling of the lithosphere. Now, if we have intrusive magmatism, only part of the melt that is produced in the interior will be extracted at the surface, whereas another part will remain trapped in the lithosphere and crust and will cool conductively. And what we do in our models is to vary the amount of extrusive melt, but also the depth of the intrusions. So let's have a look at some results. Basically, what we see here are different temperature profiles at present day. And we see the effect of the extrusive to intrusive ratios. So here we have only 10% of the melt that is produced in the interior being extruded at the surface and the rest remaining trapped in the lithosphere. Whereas here we have a fully extrusive case. And what we see is that this effect has an impact on the thermal lithosphere. We have much thicker thermal lithospheres for efficient melt extraction. These are the corresponding viscosity profiles. And then again, here you see much thicker lithosphere for an efficient melt extraction. And based on that, what we can calculate is the tidal quality factor. And what we see here is that the tidal quality factor increases with more intrusive magmatism. And this is because typically in this case, you have a higher viscosity in the interior. Now, another factor that affects the tidal quality factor is the depth dependence of the viscosity. The depth dependence of the viscosity affects the temperature in the deep interior and less so in the shallow mantle. And what we see here are different profiles, different viscosity profiles for different cases. So we have a nearly isoviscous case in the mantle here, and we have an extreme case with more than 3 orders of magnitude viscosity increase with depth. And then when we calculate the tidal quality factor Q, what we see is that models with a strong increase of viscosity with depth, they have large tidal quality factors or large phase lags. And this is important because, as I mentioned before, we have theoretically inferred values in the range of 2200. And that means that all the models located here on the left side would be compatible with these theoretically inferred values. However, as I said, we don't really have a measurement, true measurements for the tidal quality factor. And this will be performed by Envision and Veritas in the future. And we can use the measurements by Envision and Veritas to actually put constraints, much stronger constraints on the viscosity structure in the interior of Venus, and therefore also on the thermal state of the interior. Another thing that we can do currently with the current data is to look at these models and look at the gravity and topography correlation and admittance that you see here. So for all these models that we are showing here, we see the correlation and admittance of gravity and topography data. And what we see, we compare this to observations. So here the white line are the observations. And what we see is that some of the models can actually be excluded. These are these models that show negative correlation and admittance, that they don't match the data, the current data that we have. And basically, these models are the ones that have a very strong increase of viscosity with depth. So to some extent, we can exclude already some of the models with very high increase of viscosity with depth that also lead to very high tidal quality factors. Going further of looking at another effect of these models, and we have heard that during the discussion already, is that in these models we can promote surface mobilization by using this kind of yield strength to promote surface recycling. And what you see here are 3 different cases, 3 different scenarios. The reference case here that you see in orange, this one, does not have we don't prescribe an yield strength, and we have surface mobilization only because we have intrusive magmatism. We have another model here that shows kind of like an episodic behavior, and another model in the back in gray color that has a very strong surface mobilization. And in this case, we see that the tidal quality factor is affected by the surface mobilization. And what we see is that typically for surface mobilization events, the tidal quality factor increases. And this is because, again, you efficiently cool the interior, you have higher viscosities, and therefore larger tidal quality factors. I also wanted to mention this because I mentioned at the beginning that we can use K2, the tidal luff number K2 estimates that we currently have, in order to see whether we can constrain some of the models that we have. And since the tidal luff number K2 is sensitive to the core size, what we have done here is to vary the core size in our models. And what we see is that models with a relatively large core size can already be excluded. Here again, we will have much better values from Veritas and Envision that will help us to constrain the models even more. So to come to the conclusions, what we have seen from these models is that models that have a moderate increase of viscosity with depth are compatible with the inferred theoretical values of the tidal quality factor, and also with gravity and topography data. We see high tidal quality factors for surface mobilization events. We can exclude some of the models with very large core radii, and as I mentioned before, we will have much better data with Veritas and Envision, and we hope to constrain the interior and thermal states of Venus much better in the future. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Also on time, perfect. All right, so the next talk will be given by Madeline Kerr. The title of the talk is A Dynamical Framework for Venus's Interior and Coronae Formation.
And today I'll be discussing a dynamical framework, or a possible dynamical framework, for Venus's interior and specifically corona formation. And this is work that I've done with two-dimensional mantle convection models that incorporate mineral phase transitions. So by a dynamical framework, I mean the physical model that can explain the largest scale volcanic features and patterns of a planet as a manifestation of its underlying mantle processes, such as mantle convection. And in the very familiar case of Earth, that dynamical framework is plate tectonics, where we have mid-ocean ridges spreading up, or we have mid-ocean ridges, we've got ocean trenches with arc volcanism, and we've got chains of hot spots. And from these observations, we have a model for Earth where the mid-ocean ridges are spreading apart, plates are subducting at these trenches and generating the volcanism, and large hot mantle plumes from the core mantle boundary are rising up through the mantle and forming the hotspot chains. And in this talk, I'm going to motivate a previously established idea that for Venus, perhaps the dynamical framework is an ephemerally layered convective regime, and propose that this ephemerally layered convection is due to upper mantle mineral phase transitions. So like I said, volcanism on Earth is mostly related to plates and plate boundaries. But on Venus, it's a lot more widespread, as everyone else has said in this session. And the distribution, or the global configuration of plume-driven features on Venus is likely the key to unlocking what's happening in the interior. At least that's what we believe through this modeling framework. So this is an example of a large volcanic rise. It's Beta Regio, and there are about 10 of them on the surface of the planet, and they can range, they can be over 100 or 1,000 kilometers across, and they're thought to be formed by large sustained mantle plumes from the core mantle boundary. Zooming in here is a corona, as have been discussed, and these are roughly annular or circular volcanotectonic features, also thought to be formed up by a smaller, more transient mantle plume. But some also regional scale models have shown that they could be formed by sublithospheric drips, or cold drips from the lithosphere. And these exist mostly on the order of 100 kilometers, but between 60 and over 1,000 too. So there's large ranges in sizes. Well, yeah, I guess gives away the point. But so a dynamical framework for Venus that we believe should be able to explain the coexistence of these largest scale mantle plumes as well as these small scale mantle plumes in the same convective regime at the same time. So this is best exemplified in the Bat region, which is named after the Beta, Atla, and Themis regios. And the corners of this giant triangle are large volcanic rises, probably from large-scale mantle plumes, and they're coexisting with these many over 100 thermals or smaller plumes, more transient plumes. And this picture does a nice job of showing the juxtaposition in the scale of these features. And so previous models, or previous like cartoon models to explain how these two different scales can coexist has been the presence of an internal boundary layer in the middle of the planet, so that the hottest plumes like rise up from the core mantle boundary and form the large volcanic rises, and at an internal boundary layer, smaller drips form, and those form the more abundant corona that exist on the surface of Venus. So we know that on Earth, mineral phase transitions affect convective dynamics, like at the 660 discontinuity. And so we thought it would be interesting to see what the effect of mineral phase transitions is on the simple case of a stagnant lid planet, even though the lithosphere might be a lot more complex than that. But in the stagnant lid case, we did compressible mantle convection simulations using the geodynamic code aspect, and we used a mantle composition of pyrolite, which was generated or used. We used a lookup table with the software Hephaesto, which gave us the different physical and thermodynamic parameters with depth and temperature. And then lastly, we used a new formulation of the governing equations that is built into Aspect that has shown improvement in the modeling of mineral phase transitions. And so we scanned a series of mantle temperatures ranging from the Earth-like 1600 Kelvin to maybe the limits of subsolidus convection at 2000 Kelvin. And we saw that for mantle temperatures greater than 1850 Kelvin, the mantles begin to ephemerally or partially layer. And this is due to the phase transition of Wadsleyite to majorite plus ferropyroclase, which is this red, blue boundary here, red, hot, blue, cold. And what's happening is it's creating this basically trapping mechanism where the cold stuff can't go down and the hot stuff can't come up unless it is strong enough buoyantly. So let's walk through sort of the dynamical things that are happening in an ephemerally layered convection regime. So there are two scales of upwellings and two scales of downwellings that we see. On the downwelling side, we have these small sublithospheric drips that could have the circular depressions on the surface that are characteristic of some corona, and they accumulate in the upper mantle. And then on the opposite end of the domain, we've got these large plumes from the core mantle boundary, and these can rise up and effectively punch through the phase transition to generate the large volcanic rises. Then what happens is that these cold drips are accumulating, and like phase buoyancy and temperature and thermal buoyancy are fighting each other, and they eventually gives way to these large mantle avalanches, and then induced by the return flow, or the mantle avalanches induce a return flow that generates a lot of these small secondary plumes that are hot and on the 100-kilometer scale. So we want to know, how do these model features compare with other observations that we have of the planet? So, wow, I'm going fast, man. Here is the nice image that shows sort of the increase in layering with different mantle temperatures. So all of the simulations we ran to a steady state to sort of capture like what's happening at a given temperature, i.e. what's happening at a given sequence of upper mantle mineral phase transitions. And so for comparing to the surface, comparing for some observations of Venus, we take evenly sampled points along the outer boundaries of the planet, outer edge of the planet, and compute heat fluxes there or get the dynamic topography there. And so in the heat flux case, we can plot the distribution as a histogram, and we see, as we would expect, that the hotter the mantle, the higher the heat flux through the stagnant lid. But also what's interesting is that we get a more variable heat flux over the more variable heat flux distribution over the entire surface of the planet, which is interesting and sort of goes, maybe it might imply that there might be a different sort of Rayleigh-Nusselt scaling happening, which is ongoing work. And we compared to Venus surface heat flow estimates, which have been derived from estimates of the elastic lithosphere thickness of Venus, and that value is around 21 terawatts, which the corresponding heat flux is plotted here, and that sort of lies comfortably between the 1900 and 2000 Kelvin regime. And finally, in this talk, I'll talk about comparing our dynamic topography to surface deformation on the planet. And this is Baltis Vallis Canali, which is a really long lava flow channel. It's over 7,000 kilometers long. So yeah, wow. And a recent paper by Conrad and Nimmo in 2023 took a power spectra of the surface deformation that this lava flow channel has undergone since it was emplaced 150 to 500 million years ago. We don't know. And they identified three significant peaks, which are shown here. They identified the low wavelength peak to, the short wavelength peak to deformation belts at around 225 kilometers. And they identified a longer wavelength peak at 3,500 kilometers, which they relate to the mantle depth. But they did find this other peak at 640 kilometers, which they identified, or they attributed to an unidentified process. So we look at power spectra of our models in the terms of their dynamical topography and plot it over them, and we see that there is this large peak ranging from 400 to 700 kilometers, and that encompasses the 640 kilometer peak. So in our models, we attribute this to the wavelength of upper mantle convection, the spacing between the drips, the spacing between the smaller, more transient plumes that we see, and we propose that perhaps the 640 kilometer signature in Baltus Vallis, which was previously unidentified, may be due to an ephemerally layered upper mantle convective regime. So, wow, perfect. So key takeaways, in case you fell asleep or whatever. Venus exhibits surface features that are associated with a few large and many small globally distributed mantle plumes. The key is global distribution. And this coexistence can be explained by ephemeral layering due to mineral phase transitions in hot mantles. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, so for our next talk, it is a virtual talk that will be given by Misha Zolotov. Misha, are you online?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can
Okay,
hear
good.
you.
So good afternoon.
Sorry, let me read the title, and then whenever you need the slide to be moved, just say next slide and we will change the slide in the room. So Misha will be giving a talk on the stability of NaCl, KCl, MgCl, and CaCl2 regarding sulfatization and sublimation on Venus. Okay, take it away.
Okay, so this talk will not be as dense as the previous one. So the talk is about metal halides, such as a halide or table salt, if you want, at the surface of Venus. So I will start with take-home messages. So the central point is that fluorides could react with atmospheric sulfur dioxide to form sulfates in lowlands. Also, chlorides could sublime because of the high temperature in the lowlands and condense on low temperature highlands. And lastly, sodium chloride and potassium chlorides are stable at the highlands. So potentially, if it has happened, so this would make a mountain top white and salty. Next slide, please. So what is known about the chlorine on Venus? Not so much. So trace HCl is present in the atmosphere, and about 0.3% of chlorine is present in the Vega 2 surface sample. So the comparison of this data with the reference information suggests that the chlorine is depleted in the atmosphere and stored in the crust. So it's expectable. And what's interesting, the chlorine is rich in the Vega 2 probe compared to basalt, very strongly. So it means that abundant chlorine in the surface materials is likely exogenic. So exogenic means, in this case, formation by trapping of volcanically outgassed chlorine to surface minerals. A similar trapping explains abundant sulfur in the Vega and Venera probe. So the same story, volcanic degassing and then trapping to secondary minerals. So next slide, please. So what is known about the chlorine mineralogy? Nothing known. So we only can speculate. So in Venus basalts, chlorine likely occurs in phosphates and in glass, as on Earth, or in a relatively small amount. And exogenic mineralogy of chlorine was considered in many works. You can see some references, most of all, but not all. So based on those works, they proposed mineralogy, and this mineralogy can include chlorides, like halite once again, phosphates like chlorapatite and silicates such as sodalite or marialite. As on Earth, chlorides could be products of the HCl interaction with hot solids in a volcanic environment. And also chlorides could be condensate, as we see on Earth. But more speculatively, potentially, chlorides could be present on Venus in canali, in clutter outflows, or maybe even in putative water-deposited sediments in tertiary terrains. So next slide. So the question is, are chlorides stable at the surface? To estimate the stability of chlorides concerning reactions with SO2, which is a reactive atmospheric gas, we considered chloride sulfate equilibria. You can see the examples of those equilibria. And then we compared the calculated equilibrium conditions with the data on Venus atmosphere. So very pretty much straightforward approach. And then to address sublimation and condensation of chlorides, we considered vapor pressure of chlorides. Next slide. So now you can see some results. So this plot shows chloride sulfate equilibria at the condition of lowlands. So Venus conditions, they're shown as the red box at the top, are in the stability field of sulfates. So this means that chlorides, all considered chlorides, 4 considered chlorides, are unstable in contact with SO2. So, and then you can see the magnesium and calcium chlorides are least stable. So you can see those lines at the bottom, so least stable. So the plot shows that all chlorides are unstable, but sodium chloride also unstable. So in this case, sodium chloride could not be present in mineral assemblages as suggested in preceding work. So it's a big challenge. If it is the case, the exogenic chlorine in the surface material could be in sodalite or marialite, but not in salts. So next plot shows different chloride sulfate equilibria in lowlands in A and highlands in B. So again, plot A shows instability of all considered chlorides in contact with the atmospheric SO2 in lowlands. And what's interesting, plot B is different. So this plot shows that the alkali chlorides would be in equilibrium in sulfates in highlands. You see intersection between those equilibrium lines with Venus conditions at highlands. So in plain terms, halite and sulfite would be happy at the mountain tops. So next slide, please. So this plot shows the vapor pressure of chlorides at Venus surface temperature and elevation. So we can see the chlorides are moderately volatile compounds at lowlands. So we see the log partial pressure, so not so small numbers. So potassium chloride is the most volatile, and the calcium chloride is least volatile. It is not shown because it has very low partial pressure like silicates, so not volatile. So the point is the listed chlorides could sublime in the lowlands because of high vapor pressure. And if you look at what's going on at the highlands at low temperature, vapor pressure are 2 orders of magnitude lower than in the lowlands. So this can be interpreted by in terms of condensation, so sublimation at the lowlands and condensation at the highlands. So this would provide a net transport mechanism of chlorides from the lowlands to highlands. Okay, and that's what in the next slide, please. So the question is, which is faster, sulfatization or sublimation at the lowlands? So faster sulfatization is likely for not volatile calcium chloride, which is also highly unstable in contact with SO2. But faster sublimation is likely for alkali chlorides, which are very volatile, but not very reactive compared with calcium chloride. So in this case, also this point is consistent with the halide disappearance in a 10 days experiment of Longo. masterwork at Venus conditions. So it's interesting story. So it was disappeared. Just halide was disappeared, but SO2 was present in the experiment. So it disappeared, probably sublimated faster than underwent sulfatization. It's not clear what's going on with magnesium chloride. So it's prone to sublimation and sulfatization. So it's unclear what is faster. So we need experimental work to figure out what's going on with those chlorides, especially with magnesium chloride. So next slide, please. So this cartoon shows the possible fate of fluoride during the global volcanic activity and at the present. So what's going on during volcanic activity? So gaseous fluorides released from the magmas, and also fluoride formed in volcanic environments via gas-solid interactions and condensation around vents and lava surfaces, as we see on Earth today. And outgassed volatiles probably condense in the colder highlands. Of course, chlorides should have reacted with hot volcanic and abundant atmospheric SO2 to form sulfates in lowlands and highlands. So if some chlorides are survived until now, so I don't know. So they would react with atmospheric SO2 again at lowlands and also sublime at the highlands. So sodium, potassium, magnesium fluoride would condense on the highlands, and after the condensation, magnesium fluoride would be altered to sulfate because it's not stable there. But halide and sulfite would accumulate in the highlands. So over 1 million of years, highlands probably became salty because all those alkaline chlorine and different sulfates, are white, right? Have a low albedo, and then so it's a salty and white highlands are expected, and the presence of those salts may actually contribute to the observed low emissivity of highlands in the near infrared. So next. Okay, so next slide, please. Next slide, please, Sarah. Okay, yes. So in summary, the potential, there is a strong potential for chlorides to be altered to sulfates, and those reactions consume SO2 and water vapor and release HCl to the atmosphere. So of course, some chlorides could be condensed in the highlands, and then once again, those mountains can become light, and then as early formed highlights like Tetsera terrain would have turned white and salty during the global volcanism, especially during the formation of vast plains through flood volcanism, as first suggested by Marty Gilmore. And so finally, we don't know what the secondary mineralogy of fluorine is about. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Okay, so the last talk will be given by Ralph Lorenz, Veiled in Vitriol, Sulfuric Acid Vapor Abundance and Effects on Radio Propagation on Venus.
Is this on? Yeah. Good afternoon. Thanks for holding out to the bitter end. You've heard about salty, but I'm going to end on a sour note. Laughter, sweet. The story begins just under 60 years ago. The first attempts to send any kind of radio signals through the Venus atmosphere noticed that something in the Venus atmosphere was absorbing. The X-band radar measurements showed characteristics that indicated some kind of atmospheric absorber, and the Mariner 5 encounter that conducted a radio occultation experiment passing a grazing beam through the atmosphere. As the beam encounters the gradient in atmospheric density and refractive index, there's a refractive defocusing. The beam spreads out and that diminishes its intensity. But once you modeled that out, there was still some more drop in intensity that's due to some kind of absorber. The identity of that absorber was not known at the time, but was figured out, half a decade later. Where do I do this? Do I point it there? No, that doesn't make sense. Big green arrow. Can someone advance the slide? Uh-oh. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. The work by, okay, thanks. The work by Hansen and Hovenier identified the composition of the cloud droplets as sulfuric acid. It's interesting to note this isn't sort of spectroscopy in the conventional sense of finding absorption bands, you know, the imaginary refractive index. This is basically looking at sort of the glory, in a way, the real part of the refractive index. They couldn't tell whether the cloud droplets were made of blood, but they could tell that it was something thicker than water. And sulfuric acid turns out to be a good fit. So the clouds are made of sulfuric acid. The cloud droplets descend to an altitude of about 40 kilometers, where they basically evaporate and turn into sulfuric acid vapor. And it's this vapor that is causing the attenuation. At the great depths, the sulfuric acid vapor is actually destroyed. It's thermally dissociated into sulfur dioxide and water vapor, and the cycle resumes. But that's the big picture in altitude terms. The vapor layer is just beneath the clouds. So you can turn the attenuation into a measurement by exploiting laboratory data to basically invert the attenuation, or the excess attenuation, into a sulfuric acid vapor abundance profile. And this was done by Kolodner and Steffes back with Magellan data in the late 90s. Now, there's only 6 profiles here, one each in 3 orbits. The two different wavelengths are attenuated to different degrees, but give you more or less the same answer, as they should. These data, sparse as they are, were used to generate models used in the formulation of the current generation of Venus missions, both Veritas and Da Vinci. But there's some new data that's come to light that's prompted, checking, updating of these models. In particular, there are dozens and dozens of occultations from Venus Express and now Akatsuki that allow us to get a statistical sense of what the variation of the acid vapor concentration may be. And in particular, this work by Janusz Oślizniok, shows at low latitude specifically and late morning times that are appropriate for Da Vinci, that in fact the maximum sulfuric acid vapor content can be rather larger than those previous profiles had indicated. So if you look in quantitative terms, and don't spend time staring at the chart, it's in the abstract. Basically, the old profile, the old data, the old models, is fine as an expectation of what we are likely to see on a given encounter with Venus, but they're not an indication of the maximum one might see. And for a one-shot mission like Da Vinci, you want to be absolutely sure that we will, get good data. I mean, in fact, the Da Vinci radio link is adaptive. It kind of dials the data rate up and down to match what the link will support to maximize the number of pictures we'll get. But for design purposes, engineers always want to know, what's the 95 or 99% number, and we can use the Akatsuki data to derive a viable upper limit and then margin it appropriately. The Akatsuki data has not been published as yet in a formal form, but Hiroki Ando presented some of this at VEXAG in November, back when we could have VEXAG meetings. And those results from Akatsuki are well bounded by the maximum we've defined from the Venus Express data. So there's a new model, and it allows for higher sulfuric acid abundances. In other words, the old models were not sufficiently conservative, and that's how science works. We look at the data and we revise our expectations accordingly. So what does this mean? In fact, when you look at the specific absorptivity, how much radio signal diminishes through a 1 kilometer path, the total is in a vertical ray is dominated by the lower atmosphere below all the sulfuric acid vapor. There's just enough mass right? Enough water vapor, enough sulfur dioxide, enough CO2 that just the sheer amount of stuff the radio wave has to fight its way through actually dominates the absorption. And that's true at all wavelengths. The attenuation at X band is rather more severe at all wavelengths in all places than it is at S band used by Magellan and by Da Vinci. But locally, there is an enhancement that this revision brings in at this 40 or 50 kilometer altitude range. And that is actually important because of the descent profile of Da Vinci. We descend on a parachute for the first 10 or 15 minutes to maximize the time in the cloud layer to sample the gas appropriately. And then we descend more quickly after releasing the parachute. And during that time, the Da Vinci carrier and relay spacecraft is approaching, from the horizon, getting higher and higher in the sky. And that means that initially, the initial part of descent, when we're at 30, 40 kilometers, the ray path to the relay is more horizontal. I need to be careful with my arm gestures here. And so the path length through that acid-rich layer is relatively long. So, it's appropriate for us to take it into account in the modeling. Later on in descent, when we're deep in the atmosphere, the relay spacecraft is much higher in the sky. And so the effect of the acid layer is less significant. And that's true also for radar imaging of the surface. The beam is much more nearly vertical. But engineers like to dot their I's and cross their T's, and I think this adds maybe half a dB of attenuation for 10 minutes of the descent or something like that. But it's good to capture things to the best of our ability, and if any more information emerges, we'll update again. We have plenty of time to do so, it seems. So yeah, plenty to look forward to with Da Vinci, but we have more information that we're designing the mission to. Thank you.
Okay, one quick announcement before we go to the Q&A. Just a reminder that we have the mixer right after the Q&A. It'll be downstairs in the Aqua Lounge, and then there will be the Venus poster session. So I'll talk about this again too, and also remember there is candy in the front if you did get bingo.
Okay, I'd like to invite the speakers of this last session up to the front for some Q&A. For anybody who has questions, please make your way to the microphones. And for those of you online, please type your questions into the chat. Again, make sure to identify yourselves and your institution. All right, Richard.
Yeah, Richard Ernst, Carleton University, Ottawa, Canada. Speaker, I'm not sure of your first name, Kerr?
Yeah, Madeline.
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 Yeah, no, that was fascinating, and looking at the potential for, a different kind of this mineral transformation layer upper mantle.
Yeah.
In your starting kind of context, you were pointing out that the difference with Earth and the dominance of plate tectonics, and then importance of plumes on Venus. And I just wanted to point out that. So first a comment in the question. Okay. So we've done a lot of work on large igneous provinces, mantle plumes on Earth. So we now have a record that goes back to the Archean, into the end of the Archean, and also now we got one that goes back to 3.7 billion.
Yeah.
And so we see that plumes, the rate of plumes seems to be constant all the way back. We know the young ones are probably at least deep mantle plumes, and we have a suspicion that even some of the old ones are deep mantle plumes. Mm-hmm. And so there's that kind of notion that plume tectonics is important on Earth, yeah, no matter whether plume tectonics is some equal importance on Earth, and also important even in the kind of plate tectonic time. So it kind of bears on the question of, is Venus in a pre or post plate tectonics? And in any case, plumes are big. I won't kind of
answer that question, yes or no. That's not really.
Yeah. But the one question, so about your specific kind of model there.
Yeah.
You had downwellings, they're trips, you call them.
Yeah.
And then you also had the late stage kind of return, small little upwellings.
Yes, exactly.
And so I think you were kind of implying both of those could be related to these smaller hundreds of kilometer kind of corona type features.
Yeah.
But it is really different mechanisms. Could you envision two different kind of geometries of these corona, one's associated with drips and one's associated with these secondary smaller upwellings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually, if you go to Anna Gulcher's poster, it has like a really nice section at the bottom where it's like corona are like a surface expression or a geological feature and like maybe not indicative of the exact process. Like a corona is not defined by the process, but maybe like it's the way it shows up on the surface. So yeah, I do see that corona could be formed by multiple processes. Is that the answer to your question?
Yeah, I would expect if there's two different processes, you really should see some differences between the two though types, right? So
That's true.
downwelling
Yeah, I was
versus
thinking about like
upwelling.
the perhaps like the central depressions in that is present in like roughly half of the corona could be related to the sort of, I guess, the strain or the pulling of that lithospheric drip down to the mantle, and then corona perhaps with central uplifts or domes might be more related to upwelling smaller plumes, if that makes sense. But I know that there's people do regional scale modeling of these things, and there's a lot of complexity there. So I feel like going to the higher resolution regional scale models is really informative about exactly what morphologies can be generated from these drips or these smaller plumes.
Yeah, we actually, from our detailed mapping, we do see evidence of uplift. We see radiating, what we interpret as swarms. And so we do see kind of, I mean, there's complexities that we're seeing from the geological mapping that are useful in this regard, probably.
Yeah, it's like such a morphologically diverse situation. Yeah, I agree.
Thanks.
Scott Hensley from JPL. This is my questions for Ralph. So I was wondering, you now quantify that you get this additional half a dB of attenuation. I was wondering, did it actually cause any difference in the amount of data that you were expecting to be able to downlink because of that, or you had enough link margin that even with that extra half a dB, you didn't suffer any additional data loss?
Well, the way I'd put it is that there is absolutely no danger of our requirements not being met. It's sort of a case of how many extra images will we get. So no, half a dB, you can do the math. You're a mathematician, right? For 10 minutes out of a 60-minute descent is a tiny percentage change. I haven't figured out what it is. We're, I think, only just starting to do the full link calculations with a turbulence model that simulates how the vehicle wobbles and how the antenna is depointed, and incorporates a scintillation model, based on occultation data. And I've shared with you the scintillation model because it plays into SAR perhaps as well. So I don't have an answer to you, but just from a eyeballing perspective, it's a % or two maybe. But as I say, the data link is adaptive. So if we are descending on a good day on Venus, when it isn't that maximum value, it will adjust to take advantage of that. It's just, you work with engineers. You cannot tell an engineer not to worry about something. You have to give them a number so they can calculate for themselves that they do not need to worry.
You have to give them a number and 10% margin.
Right.
Right. Hi, Anna Gulcher. I have a short question for Madeline as well. Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I just wanted to ask you to maybe repeat the significance of the hotter mantle temperature, because to my knowledge, like also at present day Earth's mantle under sort of more moderate temperatures, we have phase transitions as well that also to some degree cause layered behavior and different wavelengths going through.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could, like, I didn't fully get the significance of the hotter mantle. Is that enhancing those same phase transitions, or is it something like a different phase transition?
Yeah, thank you for the question and letting me elaborate on that. So on the one hand, we've sort of got a dynamical situation where on Earth, we have large mantle downwellings like subduction plates, and those are sort of, they're able to, due to their strong negative buoyancy, are able to like pass through phase transitions, and some of them like layer and stagnate on the surface, but a lot of them like sink deep into the mantle. And so when you have like a stagnant lit planet, the cold drips are less strong in a sense and can accumulate more. So there's that dimension of difference. And there's also, like you mentioned, the dimension of difference with the phase transitions of different temperatures. So the ringwoodite bridgeonite is the transition most commonly associated with slab stagnation on Earth. And in these higher higher temperature situations, there's the transition that I noted was the Wadsleyite to Majorite plus ferropyraclase, which starts having an effect at the 1700 Kelvin adiabat. And so as you increase your temperature past 1700, so like before 1700, like colder than the 1700 and hotter than the 1700. If you're colder than the 1700 adiabat, those cold drips are not really interacting with that phase transition. But if they're hotter, they are. So the hot material is affected by this phase transition. However, if you move that adiabat and shift it more to hotter temperatures, both the cold and hot can become affected by the phase transition. And so that's what happens when you get the accumulation of the cold drips, the avalanche, and then the induced return flow, which generates those smaller features. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Of course.
I actually have two questions for two different speakers. Can I ask them? Or okay, so I'll start with Ina. So in a lot of these models, I think sometimes we see like basalt being accumulated around the transition from the upper to the lower mantle. So my question is, if you observe these things, do you think the presence of such a layer would affect the love number observed and the phase lag?
So in the models, we haven't, the models that I showed, we haven't included phase transition yet. So we have several other models where we do have phase transitions, and we have some more sophisticated models where we are looking actually at melting, calculating how much melt, how much crust we produce. So these models that I showed, they didn't have this this kind of feature inside. Now, your question was whether we can see this in the
I guess if you would affect
in the tidal quality factor,
yeah,
or
and the love number.
I mean, it depends on how strong this accumulation is and how much it can affect the viscosity profile.
Okay.
So if you have a lot of accumulation, if you start to, you know, change significantly the viscosity profile, then you will probably see something in the tidal quality factor.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah.
Yep.
My other question is for Maddie. So when you look at the downwellings, in all likelihood, they're probably enriched, right? They would be basaltic, and maybe the upwellings too. Could be enriched. So
yeah.
But so I guess my question is, and you probably can anticipate it. If you have like a table, lookup table, that would be for different enrichments. You think that would affect your results?
Yeah, absolutely. I think currently the technology that I'm using, the improved formulation of the governing equations doesn't yet have the ability to incorporate multiple components. So like, I mean, there's difference between the components and the enrichment, but yeah, when you melt something, you change it, you partially melt something, that material will have a different sort of pressure temperature map, and it will have different phase transitions that it will interact with. And yeah, that's definitely something that is interesting. Like understanding the sensitivity of these phase transitions to the composition is important for me.
Future work, you know.
Yeah. I'm a PhD student. I got that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have an online question for Misha. It's from Vincent Chevrier. I was wondering if you were going to consider other metal chlorites like lead, copper, etc., and their potential for accumulating in the highlands.
Yes, good question. So it's in my mind. So I have students who works with the other chlorides right now. So idea to explore the whole story, like from volcanic to condensation. It was done actually. Similar work was done by Bruce Fegley and others like 20 plus years ago, but it's time to revisit this story. Thank you for your question.
Jim Cutts, JPL. It's a question for Ralph. So Ralph, you described this situation in the Venus atmosphere where you've got sulfur existing in different states. Sometimes it's in a sulfuric acid vapor. Sometimes it's turns back into SO2. And then there's, of course, sulfuric acid in the clouds itself mixed with sulfur dioxide. There was a recent paper by Alex Akins, which was discussing how Envision and Veritas would try and unravel what the relative amounts of SO2 and solid sulfuric acid or sulfuric acid aerosols would be based on dual frequency occultations. and they seem to conclude that it's very difficult to discriminate them. So my question is, what are the relative absorption effects of H2SO4 vapor and solid and SO2? Do they really differ or what?
Yeah, interesting question, Jim. So the dominant absorption is from sulfuric acid vapor. That's true for X expand, 3-4 centimeters, like Veritas, like some of the ground-based radar. It's and it becomes proportionately a bigger factor as you go to ever shorter wavelengths. Now, as you get to very, very short wavelengths, ultimately you get to the point where the cloud opacity becomes significant. But because the Venus cloud droplets are very, very small, that really doesn't come into play very much. The solid or the condensed phases really are not a significant contributor at all. I mean, they're maybe not completely negligible, but they're by far dominated by the sulfuric acid vapor. The difference between X, Ka, S and X, these are not huge effects. So I'd concur with the conclusion that it's difficult to tease the different contributions apart.
Thank you.
Okay, we still do have a few more minutes for questions if people want to ask questions. I do have my own question for Misha. Hi, it's Sarah Port from UTSA. So I was wondering, you mentioned that, chlorides and salts could contribute potentially to the radar anomaly in the highlands of Venus. Do you have any idea on how much chlorine would be needed in order to affect it and in order to even observe that on the radar anomaly?
Sarah, so it was my point was not about radar anomaly. My point was about the near infrared thermal emission. So it's about 1 micron, which we see low thermal infrared emission from mountains. So in this case, we do not need much salts because this we need like a few microns, I think, less than like half centimeter thick, a layer of something white to completely change the albedo and the thermal emission. So it was shown recently by work by Darby and Molly Makanta. So we do not need much salt to change the picture. So in this case, if you have some like white material on those highlands, so this will solve the problem with the different composition. So that might be basalts, but just covered by some condensate or product of local chemical weathering. So my point, condensate can contribute to the story. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Misha Kreslowski, University of California, Santa Cruz. Question to Misha. Some of these materials from highlands would evaporate, mix by winds, go down to higher temperatures, produce sulfates removed from the system. So with time, amount of chlorides on mountain tops should be lower and lower. Do you have any idea of time scale of this process?
No, Misha, thank you for your question, but I think it's your expertise to do this work. I think I agree with you because the speed of wind strongly increases, as you know, with elevation. So it's below 1 meter at the surface. It might be like tens of meters at the highlands. So in this case, we would expect removing of all low density stuff, as you mentioned, and then actually accumulation of the heavy minerals like pyrite, magnetite, whatever, which can contribute to low emissivity in in radar range. So in this case, so you know, you're right. You're right. It might happen, but so we don't know how this mineral is like stick there. So because you know my calculations show it might happen right now. If you have some fluorides, they can just go up and can that there as we speak. But I think everything happened during the strong volcanism. Just majority of changes we see happened during those strong climatic changes and the high temperature and a lot of other volcanic gases in the atmosphere.
Question to Madeline.
Sure.
I feel that the largest coronae, like Hang-O, which is 1,000 kilometers, is a little too large for plumes originated from 600 kilometers interface. Am I right? Can you comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, maybe the snapshots that I showed like distorted the view of perhaps, but when the mantle avalanche in the models like falls down, the size of the induced return flow can vary quite a bit. They can be small and thin, or they can be quite broad as well, and they could range in, they could be in that range as well. Yeah, I'm not sure about the specific case of Hango and like whether or not it's more associated or thought to be more associated with an uplift or a drip, but I can say that there is a large amount of spatial or with diversity in the return flow, like small plumes that we see, and these are in 2 dimensions. So moving to 3 dimensions will definitely change those ideas, and yeah, the physics is different in real life. And so yeah.
So, because there's a paper by Tessier, one of our students in Icarus, last year, and so we found, you know, the annulus for Hango, right, is about 1,000 kilometers across, but we've got circumferential sets, dikes, we think that the diameter now is 2,000 kilometers. So that's the size that we would have for a normal plume coming from the deep mantle after spreading. So from our perspective, that's kind of evidence for that one in particular being a deep mantle plume process that leads, in that case, to a corona.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said about the effect of a more transient plume or like without the conduit versus with a sustained conduit from the mantle boundary, and the effect that would have on sustaining topography or sustaining topographic features that we associate with corona versus the large volcanic rises. So that is interesting and continued work, I'm sure, by many people here and also by me.
Okay, well, that is the conclusion of the first Venus oral session. Thank you, everyone, for staying this entire time. I hope you had as much fun as I have. Thank you to all the presenters also for the day. Oh, yes, and thank you so much to the AV Techs as well. Can't forget them. We wouldn't be here without them. And so just a reminder, after this, we do have the Venus Mixer at the Aqua Lounge at 5:30. Then we have 4 Venus poster sessions tonight. And then we also have the next Venus oral session tomorrow morning in Ballroom 4. And then we also have another Venus meeting later in the day. So check those bingo cards. There's more information on that. It will be in Creekside Park Room at noon. And then there's also an early career event tomorrow at 2 p.m. And then the virtual poster session. So there's still a lot of Venus coming around. So stick around.